Stand up straighter. Look me in the face. Tell me, Winston, and remember, no lies. What are your true feelings towards Big Brother?
I hate him.
You must love him. It's not enough to obey him.
So Hannah died for nothing. Just her. Even that machine survives.
I'm sorry, Beck.
She was dying anyway.
Oh, I know, yes. Just another dreamhead. But what about the low-life scum that really killed her? What about the Terra Nostra?
That is who we're waiting for now.
Well, what?
Why?
We want them to realize that we know who they are.
This is the ID of a guard I killed. He was a member of Federation Security, a very special member. He was one of the President's personal security force.
The President of the Federation runs the Shadow operation.
And since Shadow is the basis of the Terra Nostra...
I don't believe it. It's quite logical. To have total control, you must control totally. Both sides of the law. The Terra Nostra, the Federation. Two sides of the same power. The same men of power.
Ironic, isn't it? We were hoping to use the Terra Nostra to attack the Federation, only to discover that it is already being used to support it.
Where are all the good guys?
Could be looking at them.
What a very depressing thought.
Majkl Tsarion, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here, and thanks for coming. Also, thanks a lot to Peter and Anarchos for putting this on. I don't know if he said it was my first time in Europe, so it's very, very nice to be here. Let's see. Sure, this goes on here. Yeah. We've been doing a lot of interesting things in Sweden. Anybody seen the first Architects of Control that we did? It was filmed here in Sweden, and we were doing a lot of other shooting, and it was actually that's Peter realized I was here, so he kindly thought it would be a good opportunity to do a talk, and then maybe a series, because when you're talking about symbolism, there's so much to go into. And I thought it was a really good idea as well, so it's really lovely to be here. There's actually a lot of interesting symbolism in the city, and we've been getting some great shots. There's also going to be, in April, two new DVDs as well, one called The Trees of Life and the other one called Disciples of the Mysterium. These are DVDs, and there's two other bonuses as well, so stay tuned for that. You can contact me or go to the unslaved.com website to keep abreast of those. They should be out in about a month's time. And again, when we go through today's presentation, if we skip over anything too fast, or there's something you want to know more about that we don't dwell on, by all means, contact us by email, and we can give you more information on those particular aspects. Today's talk really is about many things: symbolism, advertising, the state of the world, and so on. But it's ultimately about psychic dictatorship and how to understand what that really is. Because I think we're pretty familiar with the other kinds of tyranny and dictatorship, because they tend to be Orwellian. And if you follow this work, you'll realize that there's a conflict between George Orwell's understanding of how Big Brother works and, say, Aldous Huxley's concept of how Big Brother works, in the sense that Orwell really, as you saw in the trailer there, predicted a kind of a militaristic, gun to the head, boot stamping in the face of humanity concept. Whereas Huxley was saying, no, it will happen in a much more subtle way, where maybe the people who are under enslavement don't even know that they're under enslavement, or couldn't care, or maybe even desire it. And therefore, like I said, we're maybe familiar with the first kind. It's all over the world. And even in our affluent society, we can see that something's not quite right with the state of the world. But throughout this presentation, hopefully, we'll get a bit of a grip on how the other kind, the more subtle kind, works. And for that to even happen, what my work is really about is to gain that sort of perspective, that insight, that pattern recognition, which is essential, which ultimately is using the two halves of the brain instead of just one side, and what I've often referred to in other works as symbol literacy. But never forgetting, you see, that this is ultimately an occult subject matter. Because actually, you know, I'm not an expert in anything. I don't hold any credentials from any university. You know, I haven't invented a semiconductor or put men on the moon or anything like that. So you can all relax, because there's no such thing as a final word on any of this. We are here to discover and investigate together, to look at a very fascinating subject that is very much part of our own spiritual journey. I said in Bath, I talked 2 weeks ago in Bath, and I said there that this is certainly not infotainment, and it's not even food for the brain. That's not what this is about, my work. That might be true for other people, it's not true for me. This is ultimately about one's own spiritual development. You're here to discover who you are. And I believe this kind of information is essential to that process of self-discovery. That's what it's ultimately all about. Not egohood, but selfhood. And therefore that's a journey which we're all taking. And on that type of journey, we should be open-minded. We should have the bravery to make mistakes, because mistakes are very healthy. Mistakes are good. And it keeps us humble to realize that we are evolving, and no one person's perspective, right? I said this is about gaining perspective. Well, really, no one person's perspective is the same as another. So I'm not a collectivist, and I'm not asserting any point of view. We're discovering together a fascinating subject, always bearing in mind that it is occult. And that means that you have to adjust your settings. It's not normal, it's not official, it's controversial. And it also means that it's a process, it's a journey of awakening, a journey of discovery. It's not declarative. What we're trying to look at is the occult underpinnings of the world, and ultimately of our own selves, how the world comes to be the way it is. We'll look at criminal conspiracies, given that we understand that there is such a thing, and try to understand why that comes about. And also try to deal with this consensus in the majority of people who don't believe that there is such a thing as a conspiracy, a global conspiracy. Why don't they see that, when I would imagine most people here can see it? Why is it that other people don't? What's with that? Why do they have that consensus? And secondly, other people say, hey, Michael, you've done symbolism in the past, why are you doing it again, 6 years later or 9 years later? Well, look around at the world. Has anything changed? I've been studying this subject since 1982. I did my first talks in it, 6-9 years ago. But look at the world, look at television, look at the state of decay. Obviously, things didn't change when Majkl Tsarion got up and said, hey guys, there's such a thing as, occult symbolism in movies or whatever. It doesn't stop. So obviously the work must then continue. One can't just 1 year or 1 month say, here's what I know, and see everything just continuing and television programs and the whole matrix of control getting stronger, and be silent, you see. So as long as that pestilence continues, right, as long as that sort of psychic dictatorship continues, then you have to persist in helping point out to people that it does exist. And even though I said about making mistakes and always keeping an open mind to realize that you may be wrong. In fact, we have to always go about with the kind of mentality that says maybe everything I know is wrong. But at the same time, that's good to keep in the back of the mind, but in daily life we have to presume that we're right. I mean, when I do my work, I have to presume that I know what I'm talking about and I'm right, and you continue with that conviction and that optimism. Always bearing in mind that if you are going to be talking about conspiracies, try to focus on the facts. Try to be eloquent, try to be articulate, and then try to always, base things on as much fact as you can. And which is why a lot of my work is really based on insiders. I go to the horse's mouth, to the actual works of the people who have either first-hand knowledge because they work behind the scenes. There's many names I could mention. And even to the memoirs and the letters and the writings of the establishment figures who've put this whole architecture of control into place. Try to stay close to their works, so that you have the facts, you have the proof. When you're talking about conspiracy, as I said, it's very important to be rational and focused and factual, because actually, if you go to the Collins Sociological Dictionary or any good sociological dictionary and look up the word conspiracy, it's a genuine sociological term, by the way. It's accepted that there are criminal conspiracies of all sorts. And these dictionaries say that, look, it's only reprehensible to talk about a conspiracy if it's delivered in some sort of bizarre, absurd, outlandish, or irrational manner, and obviously if it's delivered without any verifiable evidence. So please take note again of the sources that I mentioned, the books, the teachers, the philosophers, whatever. Follow them up. Like I said, we're all free to investigate together. Don't accept a word that I'm saying. Follow it up on your own time and look into the works that we share with you. And take on board those as well of the different teachers and thinkers that I present. That I think is also very crucial. And ultimately make it your own journey. A person who's a teacher is only really a guideline. He can draw a map, or he can show you a map, but he can't walk the countryside for you. So it's very active, it's very participatory. One has to realize fundamentally that it's not just mind food, brain food, intellectualism. It's something that's eminently important for the reason of why we're here. And those who've seen Architects of Control, the first lines we said in that, it was filmed right here in Jutterplatzen, and I said, the whole thing is about who am I, why am I here, and where am I going? And that's it. That's what this is all about. That's what this is all about. It's all about selfhood. Of course, we know where to go, don't we, when because they talk to people who do alternative work and say, oh, you're spurious, what you're saying, is not based in any fact, you're just a conspiracy nut. And yet, actually, where is it where there is just the bluster? It's on the mainstream. They should be looking and examining themselves for the nonsense that they talk, and the unfounded, ungrounded, utterly preposterous stuff that we hear daily coming from the official sources. So in fact, the great teachers that I've learned from, are in fact some of the wisest people there are. And they do know what they're talking about. It's in the mainstream where the problems arise when it comes to things like facts. And one of those great teachers, G. Edward Griffin, he actually says that conspiracy, one of the darkest words in the language of man, yet there is hardly a single page of history that does not partially reveal the deadly eye of conspiracy at work. It was a conspiracy that led Brutus against Caesar in the Roman Senate on the Ides of March, that plotted the betrayal of West Point by Benedict Arnold during the American Revolution, and that led to John Wilkes Booth's to the assassination of President Lincoln on Good Friday, 1865. The past record of man, he says, is burdened with accounts of assassinations, secret combines, palace plots, and betrayals in war. But in spite of this clear record, an amazing number of people have begun to scoff at the possibility of conspiracy at work today. They dismiss such an idea merely as a conspiratorial view. And I really recommend his work, by the way, especially this fantastic film he made, The Capitalist Conspiracy. It is available on YouTube. Again, make note of these great, great people, their great work. And sadly, I should probably even dedicate today's speech to Eustace Mullins, one of the great original teachers in this field, himself a disciple of America's greatest poet, Ezra Pound. The British politician Dennis Healy said it this way. He said that world events do not occur by accident. They are made to happen. Whether it is to do with national issues or commerce, most of them are staged and managed by those who hold the purse strings. So it's not coming from Majkl Tsarion, it's not coming from Jordan Maxwell, it's coming from the top brass, who, by working maybe at a higher tier of the pyramid, the power pyramid, understand this and occasionally will let us know. It doesn't happen often, but it happens often enough that if you're a researcher and you gather this information, it's basically like a forensic detective. You gather the evidence slowly and patiently, and soon it comes into focus. It comes into focus. What is really going on in the world. But long before Dennis Healy, we have Lord Beaconsfield, Benjamin Disraeli. He was actually the first Jewish Prime Minister of England back between 1874 and 1880. He was extremely closely associated with the Rothschild dynasty and was also a favorite of Queen Victoria, no less. And he never stopped talking, both in his fictional work and in his daily life, about what he would describe as the network of conspiratorial organizations. And again, he's a very high-level person. I mean, this guy was the sort of favorite of Queen Victoria, had open audience to her, and she confided in him. And his work, Coningsby, he says that there is no error so vulgar as to believe that revolutions are occasioned by economic causes. And you know how pertinent it is today when you see so-called economic meltdowns and all the rest of it, to bear in mind what these insiders are talking about. What we'll be discussing is not only psychic dictatorship, but when you break it down, when you start getting into the sort of the anatomy of psychic dictatorship, you find out that it's really about hierarchy, control, and enslavement. And I've talked a lot about hierarchy in several other works, particularly the Brotherhood of Death interview series that we did on Red Eyes Creations, and on the Origins and Oracles series I did, and also in Program 1 of Architects of Control. We talked about it. It's very important to understand the difference, you see, between hierarchy and holarchy. Very important. And also to realize that hierarchical thinking, when you take it to its extreme, as I said in these other works, is actually a definition of psychopathy, by the way.
Excuse me, what do you say? Hierarchy and what was another?
Holarchy. Holarchy. Yeah. Like a hologram. Yeah. It's just like a holarchy. It's mostly a compare it in your mind to a sphere, right? As opposed to, say, a pyramid. Yeah, there's two different worldviews. You know how the quantum scientists and the mystics are always saying, see in the part the whole, right? And in the whole is the part, right? This is the holarchic model. In fact, there's the pyramid right there. The people, and in Program 2 and 3, we'll be dealing with the secret society symbolism, and you're going to see the pyramid and the triangle a lot. Not that pyramids and triangles are evil, but the fact is they symbolize something. And don't forget that in the lexicon, in the archive of these controllers, of these architects of control, everything that they say, that they do, and that they design has an esoteric meaning, and they're happy to tell you that. That's what these symbols mean. They're telling you something there. The dates, the colors, the symbols that they use are saying, we're not speaking to you in words. And everything we do in design has esoteric meaning that's only for the initiates. And this includes symbols and words. This is how these black lodges operate. We know that in wartime you have to use ciphers, and sometimes you have to change the cipher many times in case the enemy's catching up to break your code, isn't it? So they have their own symbolic code. Actually, they stole it from the Druids and from the earlier schools of light. But let's leave that aside for now and just realize that they are using this symbolism. And it's very much in their blood. And as I said, it goes for symbols and words. And then somebody says to me, yeah, well, I looked up the word Hebrew in the dictionary, Majkl, and it doesn't say what you said it means. You're wrong. You're going to dictionaries? Who created those? You don't know that that is the official source? We're not talking about that. We're talking about the connotative, esoteric meanings of a lot of words that obviously are not going to be found in official sources for the very purpose that they don't want you to know that. So when they put the words in the official dictionaries, they're trying to tell you that that is the official meaning of that word. That's dictatorship. No, it isn't. And behind those dictionaries are the etymological dictionaries, and behind that is even a deeper study of words that goes all the way back into the esoteric tradition. But the dictionary is basically an authority that's trying to say, we have to find the meaning of this word. And therefore, those people who only feel that that's where they need to go, are going to learn nothing. The moment that you realize about this esoteric level, right, you'll go far. Because that's when the journey begins. In names, places, titles, for instance. It's really magnificent when you open that door. Those dictionaries, of course, are valuable. They can be used, but it's only a starting point. Of course, as I said, they're telling you this now. They're telling you it loud and clear in the last decade or so, more than ever before, by certain movies coming out. As I said, they want you to know that that everything they've created has an esoteric value, right, and a meaning. They want you to know that now. And through some of the movies that they're putting out, that's partly what is going on in those films. Where a certain protagonist or a heroic character, you see, is now going to be some sort of expert on the esoteric. Some sort of detective, Indiana Jones type, you see, who's brought in, and we watch. And these are great dramas. I'm not saying they're not fascinating entertainment. But what's going on, what's being told there? We're being led, right, through the maze by a certain Pied Piper who's now acclimatizing us to the fact that, the official meanings of certain things, that's out the door. Hey, we're going to probe into all of this. And then Hollywood comes along and goes, oh, that's great. We can really do well with that kind of idea. Oh, we're happy to know about this esoteric stuff. That makes good business, good films. It's very interesting, fascinating. Everyone wants to know about mysteries. So then they present some to you. However, since we are actually fundamentally dealing with psychic dictatorship, and also awakening, as Peter said, the world's awakening, and as I said, selfhood, we have to understand one simple fact, and that is that the architects of control, the Black Lodge, they're not interested in the latter of those two things. They're not interested in the world's awakening, and they're certainly not interested in selfhood, but they certainly are very interested in psychic dictatorship. So then what? What do we do then? We've got to realize that these people, the reason why they're not interested in it is because they are the least self-aware people imaginable. They are very much in their ego. In fact, they're not even really in a healthy ego. They're in what you might want to call malignant narcissism. And they're collectivists. They're into hive mentality. They're into groupthink. That's partly what that pyramid's all about. Right? That's the hive. The mitres that the popes wear. The beehive symbol in Masonry. They're all about the collective hive, where you're basically a shard, a broken self, an ego that relies on everybody else. You're part of a collective. You're not an individual. That's why they're against individuality. They don't have it themselves, because, to use a euphemism from Professor Tolkien, they've given themselves over to the shadow. They have given themselves over to the shadow. They are the ring. They wear the ring. Now, ring has many meanings. A ring can also mean a ring, a cabal of people. Right? One ring to rule them all. Check out the logos of the United Nations and the EU. You'll see a ring. Now, these people have given themselves over to that darkness, that Christians might want to use the word possessed. And therefore, they're not interested, and never ever will be, right, into things that we're discussing here today. Champion of the aforesaid, Edward Bernays, who should know, he says, if we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without them knowing it. Now note that he didn't say free the masses. He's not talking about enlighten the masses. Right? The operative word there is control, regiment the masses. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power in the country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. We are dominated by a relatively small number of persons. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind and who harness social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. And then you're telling me there's no conspiracy? They're the highest people in the lackeys are telling you absolutely there is one. Long time before the Bernays, we have the Fabian network. Alice Bailey, she says, behind the division of humanity stand those enlightened ones whose right and privilege it is to watch over human evolution and to guide the destinies of men. This they do through the implanting of ideas in the minds of the world thinkers, so that these ideas in due time receive recognition and eventually become controlling factors in human life. They train the members of the new group of world servers in the task of changing these ideas into ideals. These in turn become the desired objectives of the thinkers and are then taught to the powerful middle class and worked up into world forms of governments or religion, thus forming the basis of the new world order. And she was a leading occultist, very much again in with all the major intellectuals of the day, including Bertrand Russell and George Bernard Shaw and so forth and so on. And so she's telling you that there's a hierarchy of knowledge involved, a sort of drip-down poison, an infection, starting somewhere up here in the higher realm and then drifting down until it infects everyone below, and infects them without them even knowing it. Like Vernon Howard said, the man who's under the person who doesn't believe in psychic hypnosis is probably the one under it. And talking of that, it turns out that we have this amazing statement from John Dean in his book Worse Than Watergate. Paul O'Neill, who was a member of the National Security Council as well as being in charge of fiscal policy, made a shocking revelation to Ron Suskind that not only are public events scripted, but even cabinet and other meetings within the White House with the president are scripted, where everyone but Bush has speaking parts. Bush's role is merely to nod or listen expressionlessly, aside from his occasional cryptic or even cynical comments. So these are people who've been in the inner sanctum of the White House watching this fiasco, proceed. Fred Gates, one of the Rockefeller associates, in his occasional letter, he said that people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. And see, we have kind of been told this fact about the control. Not only in popular songs, ads, and movies and literature, or the stuff that they create that also suggests this, but we've been told it openly. I mean, George Orwell's 1984 in Animal Farm. We have B.F. Skinner, the famous behaviorist who wrote a book called Walden 2. And we have Aldous Huxley in Brave New World and Brave New World Revisited. Another way to look at it, though, is generally my take on it, which I've tried to express in Architects of Control and other work. And that is that, look, you can't continually be talking about tyrannies as if it is a gun to the head, and we're being forced and coerced all the time. Sooner or later, we're going to have to ask us a more deeper question. What is it that the slave is doing to not only bring about his own enslavement, but perhaps to even bring into being the enslavers? Because ultimately, I believe that this master-slave thing is a relationship. It is in our relationships on the intimate domestic level, and it is further up the fractal. And as you know, 9 times out of 10 in the so-called conspiracy or alternative movement, that is not being dealt with. There's a lot of finger pointing, there's a lot of pointing out who the enemy is, and that's very valid and important. We need to do that. But I approach a lot of this stuff from an occult tradition, from a philosophical point of view, never forgetting that there is a relationship here between the parasite and the host. And to, in a couple of lines, just express what we were doing in Architects of Control for those who haven't seen it. Basically, we're asking a question. And that is man accepting tyranny in all its forms, both in intimate life and further up the fractal? Are we accepting that because we'd rather have external tyranny in any form than walk the road of selfhood? Now, I don't know. I say we're exploring it together. Is man so afraid of the burden, the weight of being a self? Is he so apprehensive about walking the Siddhartha road? Or he tries it and finds out, oh, Jesus, that's a bit tough. That he then makes this sort of inner contract with himself to follow the gurus and to follow the leaders and the masters, so that these tyrants, both political and religious, exist? Because you won't find carrion crows and vultures in a Japanese tea garden. If you're finding maggots, the meat is rotten. If you're finding rats, it's a sewer. Like I said, the ego is the ghost that rose out of the self, the grave of the self. So once you start looking into this deeper relationship of what we are doing, our neglect, our avoidance of selfhood, could that be in some way causing the state of decay that we see? Because don't blame the vultures and the carrion crows. They're doing exactly what they need to do. The maggots are doing exactly what they need to do. If something's dead, then don't blame the maggots. So if the psyche is in a state of decay, don't blame the predators for coming by and setting up shop. Jung said it, one of the greatest psychologists who ever lived. He said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to stop from facing their souls. No matter how absurd. And in one of my talks that I did in Los Angeles in 2012, I kind of rephrased this a little bit. I said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to stop from doing their shadow work. It's basically the same thing, but it's a little bit different slant on it. Shadow work. Looking at themselves, all parts of themselves, not just trying to live in a one-seasoned world. The great German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer said it this way: men would sooner die than think. And he's a philosopher, so even his definition of what it means to think is not what we would think it is. There's a great weight in that word, a great meaning. You are the only creatures who can do it. You can think about meaning. Dogs, animals have a very high form of consciousness, but they're not sitting there. The swan on the lake is not saying, oh shit, I'm going to die one day, life's a bitch. Right? It's not in any form of trepidation. It's not in any form of yesterday or tomorrow. It's absolutely in the now. It's absolutely there. And because it is completely present, nature is present in its consciousness. They're one. We have this sort of bittersweet ability to question who we are. Right? We're stuck with it. Maybe we're running away from it, as I said, but even if we don't go there for a minute, we have this ability to think, to reason. It's something very precious and very fragile. And we can abuse it. Or we can turn it off like most of the world has done. But he says that men would sooner die than think. It is very curious that the universality of an opinion should have so much weight with people, as their own experience might tell them that acceptance is entirely thoughtless and merely imitative process. But it tells them nothing of the kind, because they possess no self-knowledge whatsoever. And he's speaking about the collectivism again, and we're going to get into that in the second half of today's presentation. I look deeper at that concept. Then I found out that, look, one really can't even deal with psychic dictatorship. After all, the word psyche means the mind, without really dealing with consciousness. You see how the road, you start with one thing and it leads you into another place? And I love that. That organic, natural, unbigoted, unprejudiced, unpartisan, unbiased flow is what is the magic. More important than even the goal at the end, by the way. You start off trying to bring down Big Brother. Well, my father was a communist. He worked all his life to bring down whoever, the royals or whatever. Did it work? Did he look at one moment? Did he look at his own self? No, he didn't. So the goal is less important than the process, the journey on which we go. That's where the magic is. But as I said, if you're going to talk about psychic dictatorship, you end up studying consciousness, the victim of dictatorship. And of course, philosophers all over the world, in every age, from Confucius in the East to the ones in the West, have always tried to understand this incredible thing we call consciousness. And they've tried to penetrate the mysteries of the mind. However, having said that, there's certain philosophers like Martin Heidegger who would never even use the word consciousness. He was very, very selective about the words that he used, and I don't think ever in his work he ever even used the word consciousness. Although he did use the word thinking, obviously he had to. Because in his mind, people are not conscious. They're not fully conscious yet. And this sort of echoed Hegel. I mean, not that these two philosophers were in any way the same, but it echoes what Hegel was also saying. And what later Sigmund Freud came to also talk about. Is that, you know something? If our social persona, the face we show to the world, is created socially by the approval of everybody else, then it's not an expression of selfhood, it is in fact a social construct. Then it's not an expression of selfhood, it is in fact a social construct. So to talk about one's consciousness is ultimately meaningless. a social persona, right, is not the same thing as consciousness. That's just a bunch of cues and affectations we learn like monkeys in order to get along, in the world with one another. Therefore, it's a social thing. It's that collectivist idea again. And that's why Heidegger was so particular about it. And for those who are actually interested in that particular concept or theory, they can go to my article on majkltsarion.com called The Disciples of the Mysterium, and we did a really good interview on it on Red Ice as well, for more who want to look into that concept. But Carl Jung spoke of this also. He said that the larger a society or confederacy, the greater the amalgamation of collective factors, which is typical of every large organization. The more aggravated the moral and spiritual degeneration of the individual. So it's an old problem that both philosophers and psychologists have had to deal with. The great teacher, Alan Watts, said that we seldom realize that in our most private thoughts and emotions are not actually our own. For we think in terms of languages and images which we did not invent, but which were given to us by our society. We copy emotional reactions from our parents. Society is our extended mind and body. Now, of course, he's referring to that person who hasn't differentiated yet. And I hope that everyone here understands that that's what you're here for in this world, is to separate yourself from the collective, not immerse yourself in it like the globalists want you to do. As I said, Heidegger, one thing he said that was really beautiful is he said that, look, in German, the word thought, forethought, denken, is very similar to the word for thank you, or gratitude, denke, which you have in this country, tak. They're all from the same root. In Norwegian, you have tanke, right? He's trying to say, are your thoughts acts of gratitude? Wow. Are they? Are we even aware of the miracle? No, we're running into the one-season world. We're looking for the authority to tell us what to believe and what to think. We don't realize the magic is all happening in our heads already. And what of the life of a man whose daily life, whose every thought, every waking moment is actually an act of thanks and gratitude for life itself? Not for what somebody else gives you, not for what other people say, do, and think, but for the simple fact of being alive and never straying from that, never moving from that. Look what we inherit when we're not there. You see, you may not want the magic. That's fine. That's your choice. But look what you inherit when you don't. Look at the price that you make humanity pay. Now, my journey with all of this symbolism stuff started back in Ireland in the 70s and 80s. And, of course, we had sectarian terrorism, and we had these different factions, and we had a lot of occult secret societies operating there. And it's through studying their logos and their imagery and all of this that kind of turned me on. It's like, you look at... I'm studying divination, I'm studying, astrology, I'm studying astrotheology, symbolism, and at the same time I'm seeing these churches and these civic centers, and then the logos of the flags and all of these different movements, and I'm starting to see the connections. It happens if you study it long enough. You think you're studying one thing, but you end up seeing, wait a minute, I'm seeing it, you study symbolism or occult symbolism or whatever, and then suddenly you're flicking through certain magazines and you're saying, wait a minute, what's this? And two very unlikely worlds that you didn't think at first were going to come together start coming together slowly. And you start to see that symbolism is not just confined to the esoteric studies. Like I said, all of these different, the images of these various organizations, both political and other, have antiquity. And that you find out sooner or later that they're simply not just confined to the political world. When you see churches with inverted pentagrams, you're going to ask some questions about what that's all about. And, of course, in my reading list included the works of people like C.S. Lewis, Professor Lewis, and also Professor Tolkien, when I was young, like 9 years old up to about 15, and the great thinker and writer, George MacDonald, who was basically the inventor of the fairy tale, as we would describe it. When I went back to America, I bumped into this gentleman, David Singer, who was one of the top artists for Bill Graham, the Fillmore Project. Very famous artist. But that was his sort of day job. His real expertise was symbolism. And I learned more from being in this man's company, just for a matter of hours, days, months, whatever, than in many lifetimes one could have learned. And I'll always be grateful to him because he was the one who, among many things, put me onto the works of Gerald Massey, to whom my book on astrotheology is actually dedicated. And his colleague was another fantastic symbolist called Peter Ballin, who had been a teacher in the Krishnamurti schools, the pilot schools that Krishnamurti opened in India. Well, Peter had been one of the teachers in those pilot schools. And he went on to write a book on the Maya and the Aztec tradition, and also to invent this particular tarot deck called the Shultan Tarot. And Peter was the one who introduced me to Swala de Lubitsch, the great Egyptian scholar, or scholar of Egyptology. So these men had a profound impact on my life, see. And when I went back to Ireland, I made sure that I continued the researches that they'd put me on to. And of course, having some Indian in my background, the Indian background helped because, you see, they tell us things that the Western person doesn't know about the ancient ways, the gods, the tribes, all sorts of different things that maybe the Western person has never been taught. And that was also very helpful, of course. I mean, they have the Vedas, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, full of all those stories of the Vimanas and the wars of the gods and so forth and so on, you see. So that was certainly very helpful as well, to a certain extent. But then, when I was about 15, I was back in San Jose. This interesting thing happened. I was researching intensely different things, and I came across the work of Elizabeth Clare Prophet. And I'm not a follower of her or anything like that. I'm just saying that in my researches I came across her work. And at that time she was quite well known. And in it, they had a magazine or something like that, and in it she had an interview with what she described as one of the ad men from Madison Avenue. Top brass. Somebody probably who had joined her organization, had fallen away from that type of work because it was absolutely loathsome. And therefore was now a whistleblower. And that interview, it's been a long time ago, so I'm not completely remembering those kinds of details. But this ad man, who had been one of the people whose job it was to put into the magazines and the movies this subliminal content that you don't see, had did this fantastic article. And I read it when I was 15, and I couldn't believe it. And it really hooked me, to say, my God, is this going on? And then this article, I kept it with me, and when I came back to Ireland, that sort of sparked me off to, it sort of like was the beginning of the journey. And when I got back there, then I went out into the field, this is in the west coast of Ireland, to really start slowly understanding the megalithic culture there. And to understand that what we've been taught in the history books, you see, is just simply not true. And I mean, as I said, my father and his father, they did introduce me to, Irish music and the architecture. So even though they were sort of atheists and fundamentalists, and he was a Marxist, at least he had a love of his own land. And from that was my starting point. And this opened a lot of other doors. But because I was young, to me, watching the trash on the television, a lot of the pop videos, to me, in the Duran Duran videos and the Cure videos and whatever videos you can imagine, like I said in the magazines, the symbolism in there was equally as interesting as you would find at a megalithic site or an ancient church. So again, those two things were coming together. And also I had gone on to study other things like serial killing and all sorts of stuff to do with crime, to wonder what was going on in these people's heads, which led me into studies of mind control and other things as well. So it all began, quite a long time ago, and what I do now is just sort of the branches of that, the flowers of those roots that were set long ago. But when you go to these megalithic sites, then you start realizing fundamentally, as I said, that look, you cannot trust the official sources. So in my journey, the theme was basically make trouble, ask questions. Make a lot of trouble, ask a lot of questions, because that's the only way you're going to find out what's going on. When I got back to America again in the 90s, it was about Desert Storm time. And therefore my interest in the political stuff started to intensify. Study of the secret societies then became much more important because of what was going down. And again, why? It's because I have already had a history and a background in the divination arts, in numerology, Kabbalah, right, astrology. So then when I'm looking at the dates that these George Bushes are declaring wars and doing things, or the United Nations is doing something, or the launching of some sort of organization, right? Or the launching of a new currency, or whatever it might be, or a marriage, or a royal event. You see, I'm seeing the patterns that other people are not seeing in political world. And this heated up at the time of Desert Storm. And then coming across the great American teachers who were experts on this, then the journey really began for me. And one of those people, of course, was the famous Jordan Maxwell. And in my astrotheology book also, I partly dedicated it to him. And as I said, back in Ireland, with my colleague Jim Cairns, we looked very deeply into that very sinister stuff about Satanism, cult activity, the royal connections, which is very fascinating, the ritual murder aspects, again, the more sinister side of these networks. And in Program 2, next time we meet together, we'll be looking at that. We'll be looking deeply into that and naming the names and taking the lid off that particular network. That particular network is not the highest, of course. Right? It doesn't occupy the highest part of the pyramid, which is where my main focus has been. It's slightly lower down, but it is very powerful. It has a lot of dominion, a lot of power, and we need to look at that when we're studying these subjects relating to symbolism. But as I said, when you go around looking at churches and you're finding these symbols like inverted pentagrams and whatever else, you start to have very serious questions about what's going on. If there was a sort of downside, it was because then a person who's studying like this finally discovers that, look, the rest of the world isn't even remotely interested in what you're studying. So it can be that can be a challenge for people in the beginning stages, of course. But the thing is that you continue, because what can you do when you know that you're being sold something rotten? Give up? Swallow it? Well, that's not my way. What else do people do? They get angry in a sort of a more negative way. They react as opposed to respond. And of course in this game, that plays right into the hands of your rival or your adversary. What else can people do? Drop out. Cop out. And boy, aren't we living in a culture that just lays that on for us? You need but ask. And every kind of preposterous, obscene distraction is made available. But if you're really serious and you realize that it is a matter of your choice, like David Icke has always said, you're going to step out of that square or not. Well, the sheepdogs are going to try and keep you in. But ultimately, it is your choice. Staying within the consensus is your choice. Or you can take another road if you want. But it requires a certain level of courage to do that. But you can bet that you won't have too many fans, right, when you take that road towards the truth. As Machiavelli said, there are three classes of intellects. One which comprehends by itself, another which appreciates what others comprehend, and a third which neither comprehends by itself, nor by the showing of others. The first is most excellent, the second is good, and the third is useless. So let's take a metaphor for a moment. You try to tell people that there's a black lodge operating in the world, or there's various levels of conspiracy, or you get into the questions of consciousness and all this philosophy. My God, you're losing people. They don't even know what you're talking about. In fact, you're half protected that they don't drag you like Giordano Bruno down to the local square to put a nail through your tongue and burn you at the stake, because they're so lost they don't even know what you're getting at. You're saved by their ignorance. But let's take a metaphor for a moment. What happens if you had come to people, say, 100 years ago and said, oh, guess what, guys? There's a whole subatomic, unseen, invisible ecology out there full of bacteria and viruses and tiny creepy crawlies on the top of your finger and in the cheese you're eating. Giordano Bruno time. That had taken you right down and immolated you. Garroted you. But what happened? Somebody invented a microscope. And with a simple invention of a relatively simple instrument, suddenly, it's a no-brainer. It's invisible, but you couldn't see it with your five senses. But with a single little instrument, you can. And suddenly, it's all clear. So how much do we really know? Now, of course, when you see these other things, these other realities, it's not so much a physical instrument that you use, it's your intuition. It's your imagination, if you have one. It's pattern recognition time. It's Sherlock Holmes time. It's forensic science time. You start putting the pieces together with great love, because if you don't do it with passion and love, you're never going to get there. If you do it from fear, like most people are doing, and do it from trepidation and paranoia, you might as well not bother. But they're simple things. What do we really know? Do we know that the word hello or hey son, is actually a word that used to mean serpent? Do we know that the orbits of Venus and the Earth together make a perfect 5-pointed star, a pentagram in the sky? Which is why this symbol was used in magic for hundreds of years, if not longer. Do we know that the guitar, and certainly the harp, and certainly the Celtic harp, the tunings of those harps, including the piano, by the way, are connected exactly to the Hertzian frequency of the movement of the planets? And that in the early days of the Druids, each string of the harp was tuned differently to a different frequency of a different planet. Do we know, for instance, that the so-called Hebrew alphabet of 22 letters, and the vowels were considered sacred, do we know that those in fact are not anything to do with the Jews or Hebrew, but they were actually created, they were shadows cast by a crystalline pyramidon that used to sit on top of the Great Pyramid. And when the sun at its full beam, which is Ra to them, remember? When God's light shone through this crystal, the high priest would notice the shadows that it cast, and then in transcribing those particular shadow forms, the 22 letters, the sacred letters, were formed. Which would then went on to be involved in Kabbalah and magic and many, many other mysteries that are involved in that. Do we know why the Egyptians chose to use of all things a feather in this most important moment when the soul is judged? Why that symbol? What's the mystery there? A feather of all things. Do we know, for instance, that there's not just 12 constellations in the zodiac, but at least 88? And do we know that those constellations, almost all of them, appear in the corporate world, in logos and images and corporate advertisements? Like I said earlier, two things fused together. Now, you may not know what those constellations are, so you probably wouldn't recognize it. But what happens if the advertisers are drawing upon that kind of esoteric knowledge? Do we know, for instance, that the temples of the Nile were actually designed to correspond to the 7 or more, but 7 basic centers that are known as the chakras of the human body, that the Nile was literally a manifestation on earth of the human form, which then was later picked up by other architects in the phi ratio that even modern temples from the time of Greece and Rome was based on, but that this concept was very much evidenced in Egypt, where the entire Nile Valley was based on the subtle centers of the body, and that as you ascended through the temples from the lowest in Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt to the Delta, you were actually simulating the movement of the Kundalini towards enlightenment. Or that the cards of the tarot, which many people have tried to crack the mystery of that the earliest references are found in megalithic Ireland. Absolutely, that the wand, the sword, and the disc and the cup are mentioned in the earliest Irish mythologies as being the 4 treasures of Ireland. Or that the famous sword of Arthur, Excalibur for instance, is actually based again on the sword of a very ancient Irish king. And that sword, it's almost like something out of science fiction, would vibrate in the presence of evil, just like we've seen so many fiction works, and that if it ever left the king's side, then he would perish. But if he kept the sword near him, just like you see later on in the Arthurian legend, no evil could harm him, and that the sword had the power to vanquish enemies not only of this world, the physical world, but could help him fight in other dimensions. Do we know, for instance, that the ancient name of Ireland, which was Scota, and then later Scotland, is actually the name of an Egyptian princess, the daughter of Akhenaten, no less? Do most Irish people know that? Do we know that the so-called Pillars of Hercules, which meant to have led the way, you see, to famous Atlantis, are not in the Straits of Gibraltar, but in Northern Ireland, and they're known as the Giant's Causeway? And that for thousands of years, mariners who went between those pillars, because there was some on Scotland's side and some on Ireland's side, said we are passing through the pillars of the giants. In Ireland, not Malta, not Gibraltar, not in the Mediterranean. What does that do to change history? Do you know, for instance, that the famous stone of Jacob that he rested his head on when he had the dream about the ladder ascending to heaven, actually exists, and it too is in Ireland, and that Jacob is really the son and the sun that passes at the solstice of the winter solstice rests his head on the stone is actually a reference to a very ancient cairn and a very unusual phenomena that takes place in Ireland. So there are mysteries. And you can, having access to those mysteries gives you that knowledge, gives you that power, gives you that understanding of things, makes your understanding of life synergistic, as opposed to the schooling way. But of course we don't know these things, and we don't even really know too much about the architecture of control, and the reason is because of historical amnesia. We don't know about history because we've been told so many lies about it. And that was for a purpose, because if you don't know about the history, then you have no chance of knowing how the world or your own times work. This is basically the plan. Again, it serves the plutocrats. And of course, we went into this in quite a lot of detail in Architects of Control, because in my theories, which I went into more deeply in the Atlantis book, is about the fact that we all suffered a very major psychic trauma in ages past. And that this event of trauma that happened to the mind about 13,500 years ago is absolutely key in understanding how we have fallen victim to all forms of tyranny since Sumerian times. This is what I've discovered in my work, and I went into in this book, and that is that if we didn't have that trauma, there could be no tyranny. We are subject, it's like we were saying earlier, what is the slave doing to bring the tyranny about? Well, partly what he's doing on a collective level is he's suffering. He's still reeling from the shock of something so devastating. It was partly an earth cataclysm, and it was partly also a interference with us biologically. Now, Esther Villar talks in her book, The Manipulated Man, on the subject of freedom, and says that freedom is the last thing he wants. Man functions according to the principle of pleasure. In non-freedom, to be sentenced to lifelong freedom is a worse fate than lifelong slavery. To put it another way, a man is always searching for someone or something to enslave him, for only as a slave does he feel secure. Like I said, you don't want to walk the Siddhartha road? Hey, I'll accept even that form of tyranny, because at least it provides me a bowl of soup, a pillow, a cell, and some security, because I'm deadly afraid to be a self. The great scientist Buckminster Fuller said that the world's power structures have always divided to conquer, and have always kept divided to keep conquered. As a consequence, the power structure has so divided humanity not only into special function categories, but into religious and language and color categories, that individual humans are now helplessly inarticulate in the face of the present crisis. They consider their political representation to be completely corrupted. Therefore, they feel almost entirely or utterly helpless. Now, Jung said something very, very profound. He said that we have lost our superstitious fear of evil spirits and things that go bump in the night, but instead are seized with terror of people who, possessed by demons, perpetrate the frightful deeds of darkness. That the doers of such deeds think of themselves not as possessed, but as supermen, does not alter the fact of their possession. So, in other words, all that's changed is the venue. We're not afraid of devils with tails and horns like the superstitious people of the Middle Ages. So what? In Approaching the Unconscious, Jung said that consciousness is a very recent acquisition of nature. And it ties into what I was saying about the trauma, you see. And it is still in an experimental state. It is frail, menaced by specific dangers and easily injured. As anthropologists have noted, one of the most common mental derangements that occur among primitive people is what they call the loss of a soul. So that's why I was talking about the fragility of consciousness. Partly we understand why there's a state of decay. Consciousness is a recent acquisition. It's newborn, and it has a lot of the temperament of an infant, and can easily be lost. It's a very, very fragile thing. I don't think any of us ever contemplate until you have to work in the back wards of asylums, and you have to deal with these poor people who are totally schizoid or whatever. And I've had a lot to deal with people like that in my life. And when you deal with people like that, you really understand how fragile and precious consciousness is. It can be lost very, very easily, and is being lost gradually in what David Icke has called the totalitarian tiptoe. We're moving towards unsanity and insanity, but maybe not in a way that we first imagined. Now, of course, he says that I'm not denying that great gains have resulted from evolution of civilized society, but these gains have been made at the price of enormous losses, whose extent we have scarcely begun to estimate. The man of today, who resembles more or less the collective ideal, has made his heart into a den of murderers, and can easily be proved by the analysis of his unconscious, even though he himself is not in the least disturbed by it. We have to face what these people are saying, because they're the ones who pick up the pieces of the shattered minds when it finally becomes so bad, you see, that you need help. Now, here is one of the most important statements of today's talk. And it's from the psychologist Thomas Szasz. He says, people often say that this or that person has not found himself. But the self is not something one finds. It is something one creates. And that's right, folks. You create it here, and you create it now, and you create it through what you call your experience in this life. It's not given to you by a God. It's not given to you by some magical act. And it doesn't come in with you when you're born. You have a spark of life that's given to you by the matrix, nature. But the soul, that thing that is really equivalent, that soul is religious, isn't it? It's a religious term. In psychological terms, it's nothing more than the self. Well, that is your creation. But you don't want to hear that. People don't want to hear that. So they're waiting for the Pope to do it. They're waiting for the religious leaders to do it, the teachers to do it. This is what I mean when I say about the absence of being. This is where the responsibility is. This is where the power is. And this is also where the secrets of disempowerment are. But Thomas Szasz wasn't the first one to say it. It's there in all the scriptures, from the Gnostic apocryphal works to the official text of the Bible. In Corinthians it says, "You are the temple of God, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are." Christ's own words, they say in John, is, "The works I do, you can do, and greater." Implying what? In the Gospel of Thomas he says, "When you know yourselves, then you will be known. And you will know that you are the sons of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you are in poverty, and you are poverty." There it is. And so don't look at the world in the state of decay and be pointing some elusive Illuminati. They're just more toxic versions of what these teachers are talking about. Origen, the church father, said, "You yourself are even another little world, and have within you the sun and the moon and also the stars." It's been said in 100 different ways, 1,000 different ways, right across the globe. The great author Marcel Proust said it this way: "We don't receive wisdom. We must discover it for ourselves after a journey that no one can take for us or spare us." So the question then arises, okay, Michael, you've done enough damage. How do we know? How do we find out about the self then? Well, that's where the trick comes. That's where we really need to sit down and discuss this, because actually to come upon the self is not remotely connected to any kind of learning that we've ever been taught. After all, remember Socrates said that there is no such thing as learning, there's only remembering. Now, he might have been talking about reincarnation, but he might have been also talking about the fact that you already are perfect. You already have it within you, and even if you think you're learning something, it's because you're bringing it out from inside yourself. But even leaving that aside for a moment, what do I mean when I say it's not connected to the other kinds of learning? Well, what are the other kinds of learning? Jumping through hoops? Gaining, acquiring, being acquisitive? Territorializing the knowledge, like a dog territorializes a lamppost and then saying, it belongs to me, I'm it, I'm the degree, here's my degree here. No, my degree is nailed to the front of my chest and the target on the back. I'm completely sold. All the ways that we gain official knowledge, and for the reasons we gain it, selfhood has nothing to do with that. You come upon the self by a completely different process that is known as apophatic process, through apophatic knowledge, or negation is a more common word, which means that you have to discover everything that is not the self. Now you have to become that detective, that Sherlock Holmes. You have to become completely critical and profoundly negative. Oh, don't say that, Michael. That's a terrible word to use. Because we're under psychic dictatorship, and many words have been misunderstood. Many words have been misrepresented to us. In the true spiritual path, it is letting go. It is deconstruction that is the power, that is the jet fuel. Not acquiring and having and wanting and owning like you do in the world. It is something completely different. It's the ability to discover what is not. Nobody said it better than Krishnamurti. He said, until the false is seen as the false, truth is not. Because truth isn't going to come to you. It's not going to come to the toxic person. See, you don't own it. It comes to you when it damn well feels like it. When you're pure and unsodden enough. And even then, even after, I'm not even giving any guarantees here. Even after you've done this deconstructive work, it may remain elusive. But it's never going to come until you do that work. That's the preparatory work, and every shaman of credibility knows that. And anybody else who tells you different, they don't know what they're talking about. They're not part of the truth. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle said it this way: once you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. So again, negation. It's actually, we can do it, by the way. There's a part of our mind quite adapted to this. Once we get rolling with it, it's very easy to do. Some people have a head start, the Virgos. You didn't hear that. Some people have a head start, and others take a little bit more time. Ultimately, I've expressed it in other ways, this deconstructive model or whatever, and I have often referred to it as an anarchy of the mind. You know, we've been trying to talk here about enslavement and freedom, right? Well, what is the greater freedom than attitudinal freedom? Do you know that some of the freest men have been locked up in dungeons for as long as 18 years and more? Read Byron's Prisoner of Chillon. Read the story of Majkl Bakunin and others who've been incarcerated but were still here, free, attitudinally, could not be controlled, could not be taken down. Now, this deconstructive process cannot happen until you have fallen deeply in love with the word no. Like I said, you have to become profoundly negative, in the true meaning of that word. Profoundly critical, profoundly judgmental. Then what awakens within you is the spirit of rebellion. It's there, it's in us. And in fact, we're in the countdown now, a so-called age of awakening. That is very much about the reawakening of this so-called spirit of contradiction or spirit of rebellion. In fact, if you don't have it, I can't say too much about what the future might hold. And as a matter of fact, if you go into depth, you'll find that the spirit of rebellion, when you look at the thing astrologically and also esoterically, is actually the equivalent of what the Christians have always referred to as the Holy Spirit. That the self, the spirit of rebellion, and the Holy Spirit are identical, by the way. We don't have time to go into it now, but I have an article on the Majkl Tsarion website entitled 2012 Shiva, the Holy Spirit and the Age of Aquarius, where we lay out those points. Now, the activist Ian Williams Goddard said, look, a society whose citizens refuse to see and investigate the facts, who refuse to believe that their government and media will routinely lie to them and fabricate a reality contrary to verifiable facts, is a society that chooses and deserves the police state dictatorship it is going to get. The French newspaper editor, Henri de Juvenal, he said that a society of sheep must in time beget a government of wolves. Well, you're getting it. That government of wolves and predators and human lice is absolutely reigning supreme, patting themselves on the back, don't you know? Pulling up the ladders, don't you know? Melting things down, don't you know? Having a ball. Because as I said, these carrion crows and vultures, they feed off all of this state of decay. It's food for them, they love it. And then they have to reward their lackeys, reward their little minions, who we see in the public domain, the public eye. You know, they're the people's champions that I've described so many times before. And we don't realize who's pulling the strings. We don't realize why these guys 1 minute are wearing hammer and sickles and freedom and all of this, and the next minute they're having tea at Buckingham Palace and strumming chords at Prince Charles's birthday parties, singing him serenades, don't you know? Well, the soulless man requires the handrails provided by society. He's the perfect citizen of the global village. He happily exchanges his name for a number and casually exchanges sovereignty for security. Power drive replaces virtue. External status replaces moral superiority. Oh, don't use that word, Michael. Negativity and superiority, those are taboo words in the Orwellian state. He relies on experts. He is, however, deeply self-sadistic, and he manifests leaders who are as he is. The great philosopher from the 6th century BC, Pythagoras said it this way: "Thou shalt know, self-chosen are the woes that fall on men. How wretched, for they see not good so near, nor hearken to its voice. Few only know the pathway of deliverance from ill." Self-chosen. But of course, what about the price? A man from not too far away from here, Henrik Ibsen, said that every man shares the responsibility and the guilt of the society to which he belongs. It's a feedback loop. If you go about negating your own psychic development because you're worried about what your girlfriend thinks and the neighbor and the politicians and mommy and daddy and all of that, you have just enslaved yourself, and you've enslaved them, and you've enslaved society. You've condemned them. Because the toxic person creates a toxic society. The schizoid person creates a schizogenic society. And the paranoid person creates the global village. You make the mud that creates the bricks, and you're handing it to these Gores and Bushes and whoever else, Brzezinskis and Kissingers. They're just building the wall, but you're handing them the bricks. Thousands of years, 399 BC. We're talking Plato here. States are as men. They grow out of human characters. We'll have a short pause while we change the slides, but I'll leave you with Aldous Huxley here. He says that in his Brave New World Revisited, the 21st century will be the era of the world controllers. So they're already predicting it. They know it's on its way. They got their fingers on the pulse of humanity. They know about the temperament. They know just how much loss of self is happening. And then they know when to move forward, exactly on the time. It's like a ballet for them. So he said, the 21st century will be the era of the world controllers. The older dictators fell because they could never supply their subjects with enough bread, enough circuses, enough miracles, and mysteries. And remember that line, mysteries, by the way, because when we talk about the difference between the esoteric and exoteric branches of religion, this will be important. He says that under a scientific dictatorship, education will really work. And most men and women will grow up to love their servitude and will never dream of revolution. There seems to be no good reason why a thoroughly scientific dictatorship should ever be overthrown. So the Architects of Control project, the series, looks at this question of technology in this regard, in this philosophical manner. To say, is that what these technocrats are about? Is that what Brzezinski's technotronic age is all about? Is that what the post-human world is about? And then next time we meet, next month, we'll be talking about that technotronic age. Is this the methodology that they're using? They're pushing through the movies and the ad copy because they really believe in this? And they know that man is just about ready to give up his very selfhood. He's come to quite a lot. He's gone quite far in that negation. He's gone quite far in that avoidance. So the time is right. And they will not be coming to our doors to jackboot us and incarcerate us. We will be going to them for the stamp. We will be crying out for their medications, crying out for their panaceas, and crying out to be an inhabitant in their global village. So see, in my work, I'm not really concerned about the global village. I am concerned about the so-called creature that's going to inhabit it. Maybe I don't want to live there with the kind of people, see? That's my concern. But being an optimist, you say, okay, let's look at that, but then let's discover what brings it about in the first place, because then maybe we can find the switch and turn it off. Because I'm not interested in a decorated incarceration. I'm not interested in a tyranny without tears. I'm not interested in being a smiling depressive. And I'm not interested in having a prison cell that's, cleaner and brighter and better than the previous one. Chains of gold are still chains. And in fact, we have kind of got soft in the West because of the affluence. We'll talk about this later also. We're sort of bought off by a certain level of affluence that, the people in the Amazon jungle who pull their curtains aside and see what Big Brother's doing, they're no illusion, see? We've been sort of paid off by the carrot as well as having the stick. But tomorrow's inescapable cyber purgatory, you see, this sort of dystopia that's as old as Francis Bacon and from before. This is where you will find humanity being incarcerated, but the problem is if it's by his will, if humankind want this kind of servitude or enslavement, then it's unbreakable. And we are now in the countdown situation to that. That's what it's all about. And the only key to change that is turning within. You awaken when you turn within. You look outside, you're asleep. As we saw, Bernays, these are the people working overtime to do what George is saying there. They even like to tell you about it. In his book Propaganda, he said it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without them knowing it. Again, not talking about free, enlighten, serve mankind. They're talking about regiment and organize and control. Another champion of that kind of control, psychopath extraordinaire, Dr. Jose Delgado, one of the people very involved, along with Dr. Cameron, in the MK Ultra and the control of the mind, this very technocratic, scientific dictatorship. He said the individual is defenseless against direct manipulation of the brain because he is deprived of his most intimate mechanisms of biological reactivity. In experiments, electrical stimulation of appropriate intensity always prevailed over free will. You know, they think of you as a guinea pig anyway, so it's just about the mechanical operation of the robot, of the remote control creature, the remote control slave. He said it's always prevailed over free will. For example, a flexion of the hand evoked by stimulation of the motor cortex cannot be voluntarily avoided. Destruction of the frontal lobes produced changes in effectiveness which are beyond any personal control. Remember we said they don't want selfhood, they don't have it for themselves, and they certainly don't want it for the underclasses that they wish to control. Speaking of that, let's pause for 1 second. I want to play something along those very same lines.
One characteristic of our culture, I think, is what I would call psychophobia. We're psychophobic. We're frightened of our own minds, of our own psyches. There is no book going around that is seems to me more explicit about this in its own way than DSM-3, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, 3rd edition, which is calls itself a compendium of criteria of mental disorder that lists any unusual perceptual experience is a criteria of mental disorder. Any unusual perceptual experience, sixth sense, clairvoyance, telepathy, others can feel my feelings. I feel the presence of a dead, or a poster presence of a dead person in the room with me who's not there. You're allowed to do that for 3 weeks after your mother dies. After that, it is criteria of mental disorder. So what seems to there be proposed is a massive project of homogenizing experience, where all experience the same thing at the same time. No one's going to be allowed to experience anything different from anyone else. You're not allowed to see the sky as grey if other people see it as blue. That is a perceptual change that is a criteria of disorder. All over the world, for all types of places, these criteria for mental disorder, as far as I can see, have been ordinary expressions of the ordinary human heart and soul. We are in the process of, I think, under the name of cultivating health, we're in the process of culturing it out.
So that was R.D. Laing, another very, very important person to research. His works, The Divided Self, are masterpieces on relationships, family dynamics, and psychopathy. He's actually one of a few psychologists who don't really believe in psychiatry, actually. They come under the heading of the anti-psychiatrist because they say that, look, insanity is a perfectly normal state of affairs to an abnormal society. It's society that is broken. And you can see what impact this would have for the raising of children and so on. And they believe that basically that entire Leviathan of that medical Leviathan is, as he says, to engender psychosis. They don't want you to differentiate. And therefore they're at this. All these orgs are at this, to erase a man's sense of self. Very, very crucial points that Dr. Lang is making. Dr. D.W. Winnicott says that if society is in danger, it is not because of man's aggressiveness. Remember we were talking about the misrepresentation of certain terms? It's because of the repression of personal aggressiveness in individuals. In the book Money and Class in America, Dr. Lapland, or Lewis Lapland, says, no matter how effusive our rhetoric to the contrary, most Americans cannot bring themselves to trust the unaffiliated individual. We prefer to repose our confidence in institutions, a brand name, a corporation, a bank. It is the figure of Babbitt or Cyrus Vance, not Clint Eastwood, who represents the triumph of the American dream. He goes on to say that the man who goes along to get along, who knows the right people and belongs to the right clubs, whose every opinion seconds the nomination of the chairman, who submits easily and with a winning smile to what de Tocqueville called the tyranny of the masses. They're addressing collectivism. Another one of the boss hogs is happy to tell you that the stuff with which we work is the fabric of men's minds. That's why I call it a psychic dictatorship. Yeah. It's not that these people are incapable of using the gun to the head. I mean, I'm from Ireland, right? They can do it when it serves them. But it's so much easier, you see, to have the compliant remote control slave. One of the first women at the turn of the century, turn of 19th century, to investigate deeply secret societies and wrote several monumentally brilliant books on the subject was Nesta Webster. And she said that the final goal, and she really hit the nail on the head here, she says the final goal of world revolution is not socialism or even communism. In other words, not the isms. Don't focus on that. It is not a change in the existing economic system. It is not the destruction of civilization in a material sense. The revolution desired by the leaders is a moral and spiritual revolution, an anarchy of ideas by which all standards set up throughout 19 centuries shall be reversed. Now, we talked about hive mentality, groupthink. Another term for it, coined by Charles T. Tart, the psychologist at the University of California, is consensus trance. And it can be briefly understood as, look, if it's not in the media, as far as we're concerned, it didn't happen. And if it did not happen, but it is in the media, it happened. A more common word for it is propaganda. And that's a systemic attempt by an interested individual or individuals to control the attitudes of groups, of individuals through the use of suggestion, and consequently to control their actions. And that word, actually, propaganda, is from the Latin propagare, which means the gardener's practice of pinning the fresh shoots of a plant into the earth in order to reproduce new plants, which will later take on a life of their own. Basically, the implication there is that it's introducing something foreign or pathogenic. So that's how the parasite works. Every mosquito, before it drains your blood, has to secrete some of its saliva into you first. So there's this injection first, spreading the disease. It's something which is foreign to your ordinary nature. Said in other works that I did on symbolism, that if man is not progressing spiritually, in all senses of that word, and he's striving hard. I mean, you know, people who are on the spiritual path will always tell you they've done everything they can, they're working very hard. Well then, don't you see that it implies that there's a weight holding you down? And that you're going to need that deconstructive mindset? Because you can keep pushing against the boulder, it's not going to do anything. This is a very yin thing. This is very Shiva, Shivite. This is very Shiva, Shivite. If a hot weather balloon isn't if a balloon isn't rising, maybe the weights are still tied to the ground. Let them go and the balloon flies without any effort. It doesn't require any effort, you see. And that's what I think is happening in terms of consciousness. One of the ways that they propagate this propaganda and consensus trance I've talked about a lot is through the word, what I've referred to as talismanic words and terms. And these are well known to politicians and preachers and people who have understood, like Professor Tolkien's character Saruman, the power of the word, the power of speech to control the mind. It's a very esoteric concept that ties into the gods Mercury and Hermes and so on. We don't have time to explore. But my God, have we not had that in recent times, you see. Certain words that are thrown up there. And the study of these particular words, looking at their esoteric meaning, what they might imply connotatively or to the unconscious mind even, is very important. In an article by Paul Levy online called Breaking Bush's Spell, he says that George Bush is a master hypnotist who skillfully puts people under his spell. Bush mesmerizes people by using simple, repetitive phrases. To quote Nazi propaganda chief Goebbels, propaganda must therefore always be essentially simple and repetitious. Keep repeating them in this simplified form despite the objections of the intellectuals. Bush's talking points, his buzzwords, are his incantations. These magic words act as opiates to the fearful masses. To quote ex-Harvard University president James Bryant Conant, some of mankind's most terrible misdeeds have been committed under the spell of certain magic words or phrases. This is again the power of the word. And how do we make a word? We spell it. And to emphasize that point,
the world judged the Iraqi regime was a dangerous aggressor. In the interests of world peace and regional security, the community of nations required Iraq to surrender its offensive arsenal, its chemical and biological weapons, and abandon its nuclear weapons program. Iraq agreed to comply.
The world judged the Iraqi regime to be a dangerous aggressor. In the interests of world peace and regional security, the community of nations expelled Iraq from Kuwait, required Iraq to surrender its offensive arsenal, its chemical biological weapons, and to abandon its nuclear weapons program. Iraq agreed to comply. Iraq's continued defiance of the community of nations presents a challenge which must be addressed.
Presents a challenge which must be addressed. It is inherently dangerous
to allow a country such as
Iraq to retain weapons of mass destruction, particularly in the light of its past aggressive behaviour.
If the world community fails to disarm Iraq, we fear that other rogue states will be encouraged to believe that they too can have these weapons, these most deadly of weapons, to systematically defy international resolutions, and that the world will do nothing to stop them.
That is the ultimate nightmare,
which the world
Mr. Speaker,
must take decisive and effective steps to prevent.
Possession of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons by terrorists would constitute a direct, undeniable, and lethal threat
including
to
Canada
Australia and its people. The world has tried for years other means, but so far to no avail. We cannot walk away from the threat that Iraq's continued possession of weapons of mass destruction constitutes to its region and to the wider world. In the final analysis, Mr. Speaker, the absolute conviction of the government is that disarming Iraq is necessary for the long-term security of the world and is therefore manifestly in the national interest of Australia.
In the final analysis, disarming Iraq is necessary for the long-term security of the world, to the collective interests of our historic allies, and therefore manifestly, Mr. Speaker, it is in the national interest of this country.
And so on and so forth. President of Canada, President of Australia. No ostensible connections and exactly the same script practically word for word. We have many other examples of this. No conspiracy. Nobody higher up. It's all coming from their minds and their brains. Remember John Dean's statement about how Bush's attitude in the White House when they're sitting there? Like he's just sitting there officiating over some sort of macabre play? How much do we know about these words? Do we know that government is actually from gubernare, and mente is mental, the governance of the mind? Do we know, for instance, that the word to entertain, what it really means? For instance, that in Norwegian, actually, it means to be held under, to hold, to be held down. Entertain in Norwegian means to be held under, just like to be amused or amazed means to be confused, to distract. Yep. We know that the religious world is full of this type of talismanic wordsmithery, you see. Take a word that's used so ubiquitously, like spirit. What does the word really mean? Little more, actually, than breath. That's what it really means. But look at the loadedness of that word. Look what it's come to mean in the mind of people. When we look at this word, for instance, enlightenment, I would say that almost 100% of the people here, or anyone watching this, has a very clear understanding in their mind of what this means. And they're envisioning light, like luminescence. But in fact, has anyone thought that it also could mean lightness, as in weight? Very few. And yet, perhaps if we think about the word enlightenment and think, does it really mean, is it really connected to light and luminescence? What is light? Can light not conceal as much as it reveals? If you look at the first card of the tarot, the Fool, if you look at what the Taoists were saying, could it be that enlightenment is really a sense of lightness, in a sense of weight? But the thing is, you see, that we're, by this abnegation, by this avoidance, like Patrick McGowan said, everybody votes for a dictator. Now, you might say, yes, but I don't vote for your dictator. I prefer this guy. You prefer that guy. But at the end of the day, does it really matter what the stereotype is? We come back to this idea that it's going to be a profoundly attitudinal sense of freedom that basically is the beginning of this differentiation, individuation, selfhood process. Which is why then you can understand why it's not going to happen for everybody. Because that's the criteria. You already have to have that that sense of attitudinal independence. And one might even argue that you either have it or you don't. Maybe it cannot be instilled in someone who doesn't already have it. What we do know is that it's being uninstilled. We know that it's being suppressed deeply. And the experts who know, who have the evidence, they know this, that this is happening every day, every day. And so when we get to grips with that dynamic, there's a deeper sense of responsibility involved, because might we not also be doing that to other people? William Blake said, the fist that crushes the tyrant's head becomes a tyrant in its stead. We might be pointing at that tyranny over the hill or in the other valley, but we must observe our own relationships in life, and even, most importantly, our relationship with our own selves. How do we relate to our own selves? I went into this in other talks about the self-sadism that's implicit in our attitudes about ourselves, tying back into what Heidegger and even Hegel are talking about, the social persona. If everything that we know about ourselves, everything, is based on the approval rating of other people, and also the fact that we don't get the approval we require, what a mess. And then if everyone's doing that likewise, what a mess. It's the collective mirror then that becomes the prime datum for us, not individuality at all. Except when it's the chic individuality that is presented, you know, the faux version, the bogus version, by the media apparatus that have to give you now the simulacra of it in order to keep you pacified. And we'll be looking at that later on. I was walking around Bath 2 weeks ago when we were doing the talk there, and I came across this unbelievable sign. Around Bath 2 weeks ago when we were doing the talk there, And I came across this unbelievable sign, which said, I am who I am because of everyone. It was some sort of corporation, telephone, or whatever. I am who I am because of everyone. I mean, this is Patrick McGowan's worst nightmare. First of all, it doesn't even make sense grammatically, because if I am what I am because of everyone, then where's the I involved? So you see the paradox already in there? But they're willing to hang with that paradox, as most people are. So that's why I said, I am not concerned about the global village per se. I'm much more concerned about the kind of creature that's going to inhabit it. The kind of creature that's being formed right now, who believes this kind of thing, who's just delighted to have this kind of ideology to buy into. In the Prisoner series, by the way, in the very opening scenes, they use a term which is by hook or by crook. When the controllers are saying that they're going to get his soul, they're going to get his spirit, they're going to break him, they say, by hook or by crook, we will do it. And that, again, is one of these important phrases to analyze, because it actually refers to the rule, it refers actually to the methodology of how the controllers work. The hook and the crook are the monarchic or autocratic control on one side, you see, and on the other side, the theocratic matrix of control. Two forms, one to appeal to the body and the control of your behavior, and the other one to control your emotions. Religion and monarchy. This is the way the divide and rule works. And by the way, the double-headed eagle that you see there has a crown above it. So above this is some sort of royal personage, and those who've studied my work on Athenism and Akhenaten will know why that crown exists. It's not the crown of the monarchs you see in the world, because of course that couldn't be the case, isn't it? Because that's one part of the eagle. One part of the eagle's head is the monarchy, the autocratic control, including the military and so forth, and the other one is the theocracy of the religious orders. So that means that the crown above the head is neither of those, it's separate altogether. Just like the capstone at the top of the power pyramid is also separate. And that needs to be sort of pointed out. But ultimately it's a divide and rule concept. Again, their own works show you this. In hoc signe vince is by the sign I will conquer. What sign? There. The cross and the crown. Religion and monarchy. The fusion of those two things, they're united. The cross swords and the Malta cross. To control the mind and the body and the emotions. And here's an important word that maybe we need to look at with fresh eyes. Truth. It's used a lot, bandied around a lot. Do we really understand that truth is it's really the same word for reality? And if we don't see reality as it is, in other words, if we have an idea of reality, then where's the truth? And we do. We all have these ideas of reality that need to be deconstructed. Some might not need to be thrown out. Some may. Like Shakespeare said, it's often just one flaw that can bring the whole personality down. Here's another one that seems rather controversial. Do we know that truth is one of the most destructive things on earth? Is that perhaps why the narcissistic, egoistic part of us has nothing to do with it? Because truth is ultimately very deconstructive, very destructive. What happens to lies in the presence of truth? Well, it's an old story. The ancients knew all about it. They even had personified it by certain gods, certain archetypes, like Shiva. And the West has its own versions of those archetypes as well. And you can better believe that in the shamanic tradition, they've got it. Because when you come in front of the shaman, the true shaman, that's what's going to be dealt with. That's what you're going to be dealing with, is the deconstruction of all of those false selves and shards. They're not going to be dealing with you as a collective entity at that point. They're going to be dealing with you as an individual if you've got it. And they're going to work to remove everything that does not have its roots in selfhood. Now see, we have these very romantic ideas about these shamanic groups, as if, when we talk about the Native American Indians or the Druids or the Ammonists, the holy, holy people, and we still think of that of modern-day India. No. The collective groups, whether they're Native American, they're a bunch of mass-murdering butchers and sadists and greedy people like everybody else. When you're talking about shamanism, you're talking about a very small group, a tribe within a tribe. Same with the Druids. And they knew what the tribe was. Bickering, lost, contradictory. The shaman is a very different being. He's not part of a tribe. You see, he's part of the earth. He's part of something completely different, a brotherhood of men like himself, or women like himself. So that has to be dispelled as well, this romantic idea that all the ancients had something, wonderfully glowing about them. Not so. These people their job was to monitor the pestilence even in their own tribes. The dynamics, the unhealthy dynamics there, that was the first priority of the medicine man. Coming more up to date, the great, great novelist D.H. Lawrence said that, are you willing to be sponged out, erased, cancelled, made nothing? Are you willing to be made nothing, dipped into oblivion? If not, you will never really change. Now it sounds really negative on paper, doesn't it? But as the alchemist Figula said, bodies cannot be changed except by reduction to their first matter. We have this idea through all this mind control that change and evolution and development is from where I am, I go forth. I go higher up the hierarchy. I start here, I go there. Whoever gave us this idea? Does a field do that? If you keep doing that, the field will stop being fertile. Where's the fallow period? Where's the gray area? Where's the deconstruction? Where's the reduction? As a matter of fact, the phoenix must burn down before it can rise again. This was the original alchemical story, the real mystical story. Are we doing that in today's world of acquisitiveness and affluence? Of course not. It's all get and gain and have and own and territorialize. Well, we're not going to be able to do that in spiritual terms. There needs to be a thorough revision of what we understand to be spirituality. Because if our ego's in charge of the job, then ruin will be the result of it. And here is one of the most misunderstood words, probably in the English language. There's many others, but this is certainly one of the up there near the top, along with words like vengeance and violence and so forth and so on. So it's not about conceiving new things, it's about looking at what we think we know with new eyes. What is anger? Does it change our understanding when we realize that anger is a form of defense in exactly the same way? If you're under attack biologically, your white blood cells come to your rescue, the immune system. Perhaps anger is also a defense against attack of various forms. Have we ever looked at that way, that there's a blue flame of anger, which was brought out brilliantly in the movie Hellboy, as opposed to the red flame of anger, which we all know when little misdemeanors and infractions, we just react in a sort of infantile way. That's the anger we know. But is there a spiritual form of anger that is extremely necessary when we need to burn down the thorn bushes and the pathogens that stand in the way of our true selves? Again, we're exploring this together. I'm not asserting any point. We're just reviewing what we think we know. And in this tyranny that we're talking about, this particular form of both psychic dictatorship and our own internal self-sadism, we have to factor in the body and the emotions. It's very important. Now, Jules Henry, the American anthropologist, said to think deeply in our culture is to grow angry and to anger others. And if you cannot tolerate this anger, you're wasting the time you spend thinking deeply. One of the rewards of deep thought is the hot glow of anger at discovering a wrong. But if anger is taboo, then thought will starve to death. And I've sort of paraphrased that in other ways, in other times, by saying that, look, you shouldn't be okay with injustice. You shouldn't be okay with something that's diseased and rotten. And you shouldn't try to prop up something that's ready to fall that is rotten. This is the Chevaic understanding. There's a time to build and create, but there's also a time to let something that's completely rotten fall. You don't get in there and try to prop it up. There's a natural cycle. Nature has it, the winter cycle. And we happen now to be in a cycle that this deconstructive model is very much, coming into effect. And we need to get with that gig. What's the opposite? Well, the architects of control and their lackeys are happy to tell you. Martin Luther said, nothing is more poisonous, harmful, or devilish than a man in rebellion. Yeah, to them, to their apparatus. But as Jim Hightower reminds us, America wasn't built by conformists, but by mutineers. And Ayn Rand, of whom so much drivel is written, it's a study in itself. And Ayn Rand, of whom so much drivel is written, it's a study in itself. She says that men have taught that it is a virtue to agree with others, but the creator is the man who disagrees. Men have been taught that it is a virtue to swim with the current, but the creator is the man who goes against the current. Men have been taught that it's a virtue to stand together, but the creator is the man who stands alone.
And there's a lot of blame out there. I mean, we're playing the blame game. And we all see it. Who do we blame? The President of the United States, George W. Bush. I do blame George W. Bush. He's the commander-in-chief. He's the deciderer. He's the one who sent the troops off. I blame George W. Bush for what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, the potential Iraq. I blame the Congress of the United States because this is not a dictatorship. The Congress has a responsibility set forth by the Constitution not only to be involved in declarations of war, but to carry out oversight of the executive. And this is not transpiring today. Congress has rolled over and played dead. So I blame the Congress. And then there's the ultimate boogeyman we all love to blame, the media. I blame the media. I blame CBS News, NBC News, ABC News, CNN, Fox. I blame them all. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they are all to blame because they packaged up these lies and they spoon-fed us. Blame the President, blame the Congress, blame the media, blame the media, blame the media. I hear it. You know what it reminds me of? You're probably going to think I've gone off my rocker at this point in time. It reminds me of springtime in New York. And you can sit there and go, dude, you have gone off the deep end. Why do I say spring? You live in Missouri. How cold do your winters get? Do they get cold here? Well, they get really cold up where I live in upstate New York, you see. When the winter comes in, the place freezes up and all the birds fly south. And then you sit there and you shiver as the winter goes on, and you wait, and springtime comes, and the sun comes out, and the miracle of life blooms before you. Grass grows, leaves come out, flowers, and the birds come back from their hiatus. And the birds are very, very productive little creatures. You know, they fly around, they get twigs, they get branches, and they build nests, little homes in these trees. They build them right outside my office where I work at home. And then the miracle of life occurs. They lay eggs, and mama bird sits on the eggs, and they hatch. And out from the little eggs come tiny little baby birds, and they're so beautiful. They sit there and they go, tweet, 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 and mama bird's sitting on the branch. She hears them tweeting. She flies off because she knows what they want. She goes, gets it. The little worms, the insects, she eats them, puts them in her gut. Then she flies back, and the little birds go, tweet, tweet, tweet. Mama bird lands it, and she pukes down each one of their throat. And the little birds are so happy because they got exactly what they're asking for. And it reminds me of the American people when we turn on the television and we go CBS Evening News, tweet, 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 and they puke down our throat. We get the New York Times and we grab the New York Times and we read it and we go tweet, 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 and they puke down our throats. We're little birds, ladies and gentlemen. We get exactly what we want. We can blame the media all we want, but at the end of the day, it's our fault because we have allowed ourselves to be programmed as tiny little birds willing to receive puke with a smile on our face. We have to stop being little birds. We have to break the little bird syndrome. We have to become what I call citizen intelligence officers, hunter raptors of information.
Erich Fromm, one of the great psychologists, in his masterpiece Anatomy of Human Destructiveness says, when in group narcissism, the object is not the individual but the group to which he belongs. The assertion that my country or nation or religion is the most wonderful, the most cultural, the most powerful, the most peace-loving, etc., does not sound crazy at all. On the contrary, it sounds like an expression of patriotism, faith, and loyalty. Well, look, if you don't have a selfhood, you don't have any psychic sovereignty, then of course the other forms of sovereignty matter a great deal, and you'll fight and die for a flag. 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years roll by and you're wondering what the people died for. Everything that they died for has come to pass. Everything they died to prevent. Fromm goes on to say the sick individual finds himself at home with other similarly sick individuals. The whole culture is geared towards this kind of pathology. The result is that the average individual does not experience the separateness and isolation the fully schizophrenic person feels. He feels at ease amongst those who suffer from the same deformation. In fact, it is the fully sane person who feels isolated in the insane society. And he may suffer so much from the incapacity to communicate that it is he who may become psychotic. And as I said in the earlier part, some nations, some people, they use the stick to goad them where they want to go, right? But in the West, there's another technique that's been used to pacify and make people docile, and that's just simple affluence. Not that affluence in itself is wrong. You work hard, you want something for it. But the thing is that the whole culture is geared this way. And this has this has the potential to pacify people. After all, when you see horror stories on television about how horrible it is elsewhere, there's a certain amount of emotional reactions that are caused by that. A feeling of all rightness and contentment and conformity comes with that alone. There's a lot that can be born just out of the mere affluence. So when you look around the world and you see the kind of apathy, this is one of the reasons that it's also causes it. But of course they do use the other side as well. Through the media, they're always instilling the key antidote for selfhood, which is fear. Or anxiety, if you use the philosophical terminology. But fear and confusion are good for business, especially for the pharmaceutical monopolies. Consumption of antidepressants rose dramatically after the attack on the World Trade Center. And in Being Human, the authors write, when faced with a life-threatening situation, the reptilian hindbrain, the most primitive part of the human brain, switches off all activity except that which keeps us alive. It sends the subconscious message, do not move, breathe, or blink, or you will be seen and attacked. Right? The limbic centers. And this response mechanism also freezes all activity. And it forces us to use the handrails that are provided. And as Clint Eastwood would probably say, it's about, he said in one of his movies, it's what man knows about himself inside that makes him afraid. So he's speaking there about anxiety. Fear is more of an external thing and can be often legitimate. But anxiety is something about ourselves that causes us to, stay in that one-season world. Something that we don't want to look at and that stops us doing the shadow work. And again, the price of that is the complacency and the willful ignorance and, most importantly, the self-sadism. Now, General Douglas MacArthur, he said that our government has kept us in a state of our government has kept us in a perpetual state of fear, kept us in a continuous stampede of patriotic fervor, with the cry of grave national emergency. Always there's been some terrible evil at home, or some monstrous foreign power that was going to gobble us up if we did not blindly rally behind it. The occultist Manly Palmer Hall, he said that to repress rebellion is to maintain the status quo, a condition which binds the mortal creature in a state of intellectual or physical slavery. But it is impossible to chain man by merely slaving his body. The mind must also be held. And to accomplish this, fear is the accepted weapon. The common man must fear life, fear death, fear God, fear the devil, and fear most the overlords, the keepers of his destiny. Julian Huxley, in the preface to Brave New World, says, as political and economic freedom diminishes, sexual freedom tends to be compensatingly increase, and the dictator will do well to encourage that freedom, in conjunction with the freedom to daydream under the influence of dope, movies, and radio. It will help to reconcile his subjects to their servitude. He goes on to say that sensual pleasures programmed into people as infants through the hypnopedic messages repeated thousands of times as they slept. These messages encouraged sexual promiscuity, attendance at mass entertainments, and the ingestion of drugs for any and every unpleasant feeling or little distress. In Architects of Control, we have a whole section on this concept of the artificiality of the personality induced by drugs. And of course, to caveat what he's saying there, the idea, of course, is not that you actually have. There's nothing dark about the consciousness. It's only because the little ego that's holding the lantern, like the hermit in the tarot cards, is shining it on one direction, therefore casting the rest of the landscape into darkness. This is the predicament of the ego. And the media know how to manipulate that by putting in front of us archetypes whom they'll identify on certain level. Look at the motto that went with this film, Batman, welcome to a world without rules. Right? We're coming down with global villages and new world orders, but look what they counterbalance this with. And check that out. Go through the Reagan, the Carter, the Bush administrations, the Clintons, and watch the very important mega movies that came out at the time. It's still happening. That sort of either counterpointed or supported the agenda of the politicians. Even the corporate level do this. We now have the angry burgers, geared towards whom? The young, the disaffected, the completely pent up and aggressive, or passive aggressive. mentality. We have the dark burger, the dark Whopper burger. This is of hundreds of examples of this. We only have time to show a few. We have the wicked meal. I mean, what is going on here? And the colors that are being used, you see, to incite and to attract you, because the idea is that they've suppressed your instincts inwardly, so you're attracted to something outside yourself that you hope you can identify with. This is what fashion is all about.
I am one of the 63336. We each have special knowledge.
We are a network of minds with answers.
Who's going to win the World Cup? Are baboons evil?
When's the last train from Leeds to Hull?
What?
Where? You can text any question
to the 63336 on
63336.
Text any question to 63336.
Zombie-like, retarded, psychotic, and look at the symbolism alone. We could spend the rest of the whole meeting just talking about the lunacy of the symbolism that they use in these videos and these advertisements. The subtextual memes. But again, constant infusion. It's always something. It's always some sort of bogeyman. You see that they're going to throw up in order to instill this anxiety within us. And also, at the same time, to make us grateful for the little bit of affluence we have, right? This is how the slave is treated. And don't we have that today? Always some fear-mongering going on. And in many other shows, not shows, but radio interviews and writings, we've gone very deeply into this thing about talismanic words. And we don't have time to give the examples now, but I've spoken in another work about the whole climate palaver of Gore actually has nothing to do with climate at all. That's why it's full of holes, by the way. A lot of you probably know it's full of holes. And have you ever thought why? It's because they're not really that interested in that thesis. That's window dressing. They're talking psychology. When he talks about carbon, he's talking about the lower self. When he's talking about sunlight, he's talking about man's higher aspirations. This is how they do it. This was brought up by Peter Taylor, the ecologist who spoke at Bath. He's onto this as well. And on Red Ice, we went into this, that the talismanic words, in fact, during the time when he was running to be president, he did a speech, one of these speeches, just before he lost to Bush, that literally took you through the 6 houses of the zodiac. Literally took you through what's called the Northern Masonic Arch. The 6 houses of the Northern Zodiac, every single sentence took you through that esoterically, subtextually. And there's many examples of this. And the same thing with this climate gate. They're not talking about climate out there, they're talking about climate in here, temperament, because they know people are ready to explode. So up jumps the father figure again, up jumps this people's champion, this animus, the Pied Piper, who knows exactly what to say and how to hive mentality everybody into a particular state of consciousness through this methodology, through this hex mentality. You think it's about one thing and it's completely about something else. And of course, we have an entire Leviathan out there who does exactly this, very, very adept at this. As Jordan Maxwell's pointed out many times, even the terms that they use, like Hollywood, are from the old Druids and the Medes, the experts in magic, sorcery, I would more correctly say. It's thousands of years old, this particular form of sorcery. And of course then they present themselves as that they are the authority. That's where you go. That's where you habitually go to receive the facts. And don't forget that they also use the court jester routine as well. They don't want people to really stand up and debunk the system and mock and show the system the flaws, so they will allow the court jester to do his act, to again help expatiate some of the pent-up conflicts that people have. They're not going to revolutionize and change the system, but they put somebody up there who will mock it and laugh at it and treat it lightly. And this also has enormous pacification on the human race. And we were talking earlier about duplicity in all of this. Turns out that Geraldo, who was meant to be reporting from Kandahar, in fact he walked the hallowed ground there. He's saying that Americans had died, and he said the Lord's Prayer, and he got all choked up. And later we found out that he was actually in Tora Bora, hundreds of miles away from the incident he was reporting on. I have something on the forum now that shows the green screen concept, that even half of what you see on the advertisements now is not even real. It's not even been filmed in real time, yet it's presented as if it is. There's an entire leviathan, an industry of deception out there. What we're getting from these people I've described as Orwell light. They're tenderizing you, right? All that hyperbole and all of that bombast, and putting people down and polarizing people and sort of using these dialectical techniques. They're coming at you with a certain kind of strategy in order to tenderize you from what's coming on later on, to flood your mind so that you can't even think. Now, Larry Flint, in his Sex, Lies, and Politics, he says that the Pew Research Center has done studies showing that about a third of Americans under 30 now consider Jay Leno and David Letterman to be news sources. Arnold Schwarzenegger announced his candidacy on Jay Leno's The Tonight Show, and later, along with actor Dwayne Johnson, he appeared at the 2004 Republican Presidential Convention. But he is already telling the world what he's going to do on a talk show, not from the political podium or in a decent journal or whatever. And again, as I said, I try to go as much as I can to the horse's mouth. And here we have David Rockefeller's address to the Trilateral Commission. This is one of the steering groups of the Fabian communitarian network that is now basically running the shop in America and the world. And Rockefeller is a very senior figure in that. And he says here, we are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications, whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity during those years. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march towards world government. Well, thanks, Bill O'Reilly. Remember I said the tenderizing? This is what these people are hoping for. The media that should be shining the light right on them does quite the reverse. It stays quiet about the things that matter and clutter up the airways with a lot of nonsense that doesn't have any meaning at all. Catherine Graham, another high flyer in this architecture, she says, we live in a dirty and dangerous world. See, they're toxic. She lives in a dangerous world. She assumes we all do. There are some things the general public does not need to know and shouldn't. I believe democracy flourishes when the government can take legitimate steps to keep its secrets, and when the press can decide whether to print what it knows. Adolf Hitler couldn't have said it better. And using talismanic words like democracy, when you really realize what democracy is, from a philosophical point of view, when you review what the word even means, when you realize that it's really a reference to socialism, the democratic club, the democratic society, that's nothing but a wing of the British Royals by way of their Fabian network. Again, analyze the words and find out what their real meaning is. Well, talking of Adolf Hitler, he said that the reorganization of our press has truly been a success. Divergences of opinions between members of the government are no longer an occasion for public exhibitions and are not the newspaper's business. We've eliminated that conception of political freedom which holds that everybody has the right to say whatever comes into his head. R.D. Laing's worst nightmare. Well, what can you expect when you find out the details that really show you that most of the people who own these newspapers and work as anchormen and editors are part of the same club. 262 members of the Secret Council on Foreign Relations are journalists, correspondents, and communication executives. We don't have time to go into that detail, but I've already done so in the DVD I made. It's like a 5-disc, I think this one's a 3-disc box set, Weapons of Mass Deception, where we go into that Fabian network and name the names and show how that particular edifice works, especially in the American context. Here's a couple of examples, though. In a dramatic movie, Collateral Damage, which came out just as the war on Iraq is proceeding, in which the protagonist, the hero of the film, for those who haven't seen it, his wife and child are blown up in America while they're having lunch waiting for him, and an enormous terrorist bomb goes off, and those two people and many others are killed as he's coming to pick them up. And then he tries to take the law into his own hands to find out who on earth did this and what's the reason. While you see in a split second, while he's at his computer trying to do, he's in desperate pain, and he's trying to console himself by looking into who would have done this, you see this clip. It's very short, and it says, "Anti-democratic forces, bloodthirsty fascist troops attacking the people." And on the right you see, is this cursor working? No. You see the cup, which is, has the love, and then you see a clip of the family that has been taken from him, right? In the very next scene, he raises a cup to his lips. It's an absolutely split second, and on it, and this is, made in the 90s, I believe, you see the symbols for Europe. You see American flag, and beneath it you see the stars of the globalists. So again, just a small example, but see, taken together, when you take all of these examples together, you find out what's been going on. Or you only have to look at the ad copy. Here on the left of your screen is a Nazi propaganda poster, and on the right is a corporate, American, years later, image for the meat industry. Funny choice. Well, of course, now, look, it wasn't the meat manager that thought this up. All companies go to advertising agents who know what to do, and they have the resources, they have the intelligence, and they have the images and designs that they know. And look at this. Absolutely in your face. For instance, here's a more up-to-date version. The logo for President Barack Obama, which everybody should be familiar with, shows, obviously it shows the 3 striations, which is a Masonic, but then of course you have the sun. You have the famous image of the rising sun. He's changed it slightly, but if you look at that, you just make out the 3 striations, these sort of beams of light or rays, and you see the sun, and that turns out to be actually from the famous god of ancient Egypt, Aton, which was the god of great importance to the pharaoh Akhenaten. And in fact, if people followed my thesis, we talk about Obama's connection to the Atnas, not as other people have been saying that he's biologically connected to these people. It's an ideological connection. All right? That's all you need. In some cases with other people it is biological, but mostly it's an ideological connection to these Atanists that I write about. In fact, the very word Barak has many meanings. It actually means lightning, or in Hebrew it means the lightning flash or the light, like Akhenaten's Aton, the light. But also Bar is Hebrew for sun, and Ak is short for Akhenaten. It's an interesting coincidence, I guess. But there's the solar disk, you see, of the famous Akhenaten, and I see that very much in the logo that he's using, and some of the other esoteric imagery that surrounds him. For instance, the pyramid. It's not that he came up with these ideas, but somebody did. The idea of the Egyptian pyramid. And these symbols, of course, are sacred to whom? To Freemasons, and Obama is a Freemason, which is a hierarchy. Now, Gore Vidal in Dreaming War says, "It has been no secret that corporate America openly and generously pays for our presidential elections. They also own the media, which is kept well nourished by disinformation from executive-controlled secret agencies like the CIA. Media also daily assures us that since we are the most envied and admired people on earth," right, that affluence again, "everyone else on earth is eager to immigrate to the U.S. so that he can share in the greatest pie ever baked." And there's really no such thing, says Swinton, as an independent press in America. Not a man among you dares to utter his honest opinion. Were you to utter it, you know it would never appear in print. I am paid to keep my honest opinion out of the newspaper for which I write. Were I to permit a single edition of the newspaper for which I write to contain an honest opinion, my occupation would be gone in less than 24 hours. The man who would be foolish enough to write his honest opinion would soon be walking the streets in search of another job. It is the duty of the New York journalist to lie, distort, to destroy and revile, to toady at the feet of Mammon, and to sell his country and his race for his daily bread, or what amounts to the same, for his salary. We are tools and vessels, he probably meant vassals, of the rich international bankers and their affiliates such as the Council on Foreign Relations, behind the scenes. We are marionettes. These men pull the strings and we dance. Our time, our talents, our lives, our capacities are all property of these men. We are intellectual prostitutes. And you only have to ask, well, you can't because he's passed on, but if you ask people like Bill Hicks and the hassle that these people who just try to spread a little laughter with a little intelligence had to suffer at the hands of David Letterman and the media conglomerates to stop them, to silence them, you'll see completely what John Swinton has been saying is the truth. The great British novelist and writer J.K. Chesterton said that journalism is a false picture of the world, thrown upon a lighted screen in a darkened room so that the real world is not seen, and the unreal world is seen. We live under a secret government, conducted by a secret process called publicity. And Congressman John Rorick, he said that the Council on Foreign Relations, dedicated to a one-world government, financed by a number of the largest tax-exempt foundations, and wielding such power and influence over our lives in the areas of finance, business, labor, military, education, and mass communication media, should be familiar to every American concerned with good government and with preserving and defending the U.S. Constitution and our free enterprise system. Yet, the nation's right to know machinery, the news media, usually so aggressive in exposures to inform our people, remain conspicuously silent when it comes to the Council on Foreign Relations, its members, and their activities. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, said that this is the secret of propaganda. Those who are to be persuaded by it should be completely immersed in the ideas of the propaganda, without ever noticing that they are being immersed in it. And the American philosopher Vernon Howard said that a man who does not know what it means to be under psychic hypnosis is probably already under it. Now you should pat yourselves on the back, because I am assuming that the people here understand that there's a thing called psychic dictatorship and psychic hypnosis, and that you can be under it, implying that you're not under it. And Huxley goes on to say in his work, it is perfectly possible for a man to be out of prison and yet not free, to be under physical constraint and yet to be a psychological captive, or to be under no physical constraint and yet to be a psychological captive, compelled to think, feel, and act as the representatives of the national state or of some private interest within the nation wants him to think, feel, and act. The nature of psychological compulsion is such that those who act under constraint remain under the impression they're acting on their own initiative. The victim of mind manipulation does not know that he is a victim. To him the walls of his prison are invisible, and he believes himself to be free. That he is not free is apparent only to other people. His servitude is strictly objective. It goes back to, again, this idea of the social persona. And it goes back to this concept that we were talking a little bit about earlier, that you can't understand what's happening today. You can't understand why the present and then the future is going to take on the form that it will until you understand the process. And so for the schools and the media, one of its most pernicious elements is this simulation, this whole obscuration of history, which is why people like myself, our work is so much into history. It's because you have to put in the foundations. You've got to look. It's like when you come to the peak of a mountain, which is why people like myself, our work is so much into history. It's because you have to put in the foundations. You've got to look. It's like when you come to the peak of a mountain. You are actually in a very good place because you have two vistas that open up to you when you finally reach the plateau. You have the landscape from which you've come, and you can sit there and review it, and you have the landscape of where you're going. And that kind of perspective is very necessary. I've often described it as also being either not too close to a canvas and not being, too far away. And maybe even alternating through your life. Sometimes it's good to be up close to the canvas to see the detail, and sometimes it's very important to pull back. If you stay too close and you only focus on one part, you become a fanatic. Yeah, and you may know it's one part of the story, and that may be very legitimate. But if you only focus on that, sooner or later you're going to become a fanatic. And your very observation will in fact blind you in another way. And if you're too far back, you may see the bigger picture, yes, but you're hopeless at being able to negotiate the intricacy of it all. So it's a constant changing of settings as we go. Being able to review history and then sort of use that knowledge to understand what's happening today. And this is what, of course, people like John Taylor Gatto is another name I would recommend. He deals a lot with the raising of children, the education of children. And most people who've looked into this will always address this concept. I mean, my goodness, I've gone back into even prehistoric times to talk about, 13,000 years ago, various massive traumas to the psyche that I believe have been co-opted by all forms of controllers and tyrants. And probably if we didn't have that direction in the psyche, we would never have been here. We would have been able to overthrow those people long ago. George Orwell himself said it. If both the past and the external world exist only in the mind, and if the mind itself is controllable, what then? So do you see that the real prison is your own attitude, your own thinking? It's not really so much what others are doing, although the drip feed method is certainly very pernicious. But at any moment of the day or night, you can change. We can change. We can change our settings. We can make that choice. But he goes on to say here that the past is completely eliminated. This is in his utopia, dystopia, you see, in his concept of what's coming. He says the past is completely eliminated. History is revised. Books are destroyed. Without print media, there's no evidence that anything has ever been different. Even keeping diaries is forbidden. People are expected to absorb and accept the new information delivered by the television sets, even if it directly contradicts the news of a month ago. Since it is impossible to prove the contradiction, it is useless to try to resist. And we'll change the slides now so that we can look at another aspect of how this psychic invasion works, because one of the great metaphors of this really, again, is this Trojan horse mentality. How are they insinuating these particular forms of mental viruses into us is a very interesting process. Take a small breather. We're not going to take a break. In the DVD that I did called Subversive Use of Sacred Symbolism, some of the stuff we're talking about is contained, and a little bit more emphasis on some of the techniques that are used in this sorcery. They go by the names of telehypnosis, metacontrast, hemisync, synesthesia, embedding. As I say, the sorcery is very ancient, but it's just been upgraded, updated in modern times. And mention in that DVD, I draw upon the work of several people you should know about. Marshall McLuhan, of course, Jerry Mander, who's very much an advocate of stopping television. I'm not so adamant on that, because again, I think it's about attitude, but certainly his theories on the perniciousness of television, and we'll look into that when we meet next time, is very important. Jean Baudrillard, the French philosopher, who spoke very, very profoundly on the fact that, look, if man does in fact end up inhabiting pretty much a plastic artificial world, then might not he become artificial and plastic in himself, which he referred to as a simulacra? Brian Wilson Keyes wrote the book Age of Manipulation and also Subliminal Suggestion. And Vance Packard, who wrote The Hidden Persuaders, you see, and the Waste Makers. Gene Kilborn, who's written 2 fantastic books, which we'll refer to extensively through the rest of today's presentation, and Douglas Rushkoff, who also wrote the book Media Virus. So, educate yourselves, educate your children. There is information out there to give scope to what I'm coming at it from my particular point of view. But, I refer you to these great scholars as well, who've done a lot of incredible work. With this exception, what we're dealing with and what we'll finally get to in this series is more of the occult aspects. That's where my forte really is. All of these writers who dealt with this poison, who deal with the media, as you can see from some of the slides and the references I've made so far, they're dealing with what is pretty much known to us all. They're dealing with that was a little bit more understood in today's world. Right? Most of us are up to speed on some of this stuff. What lacks, I feel, is this understanding of the esoteric. They don't talk about secret societies. They mention nothing about conspiracy. They just think it's about rich men having their way with us all. Of course, it's far more deep than that. But again, these are excellent works, especially if you're trying to dialogue with people in general around you, family members and so forth and so on, this is a really good place to start is with this kind of research. Now, Dr. Lechner, in his book Subliminal Advertising and Modern Day Brainwashing, says that armed with limitless resources, advertisers spend millions of dollars on researching exactly how to make you buy their product. Knowing that you crave sex and fear death, Merit would want to know how their cigarettes appeal to you. Schlitz Brewing Company spends $10 million annually to research how you drink beer. Before one can understand the subliminal techniques advertisers use to influence the audience, one must understand the vulnerabilities in humans they tap into. In other words, psychology. The human being is a complex creature. The same complexity that gives us the ability to manipulate objects also makes us vulnerable to manipulation. Once the advertisers find these vulnerabilities, and they've done extensive research, there is little the public can do to defend themselves against the onslaught. Jean Kilbourne, in her book Can't Buy My Love, she says that some of the most talented and creative people in the world are dedicated to this work. Indeed, the most skillful propagandists of our time are not working for dictators. They're certainly not working exclusively for the Democratic Party or the Republican either. They're working for Foote, Cohn and Belding, Ogilvy and Mather, and DDB Needham worldwide. They're advertisers, and you can tell that the techniques that they use and the incredibly imaginative minds that they have and the artwork, the skill that they have, the technical skill is brilliant. But it's what they're using it for that really matters. And of course, we find out now that over 75% of the young adults have a television. 98% of all homes have one. The average child watches over 3,000 ads per day. And by age 20, the average person views over 1 million commercials a year. Viewer witnesses will witness 5 acts of violence per hour during prime time. And ads take up 2/3 of newspaper space and 40% of the mail. Almost half the newspapers in the world are published in the United States and Canada. Advertising makes up about 70% of our newspapers and 40% of our mail. 3 years of television per human life. And some people say it's even more, it can be up to 12 years. Channel 1, this is a channel in America, ads cost approximately $200,000 for a captive audience. Companies spend over $200 billion a year on advertising. $13 billion of that is for children. $250,000 to produce the average television ad, and about another $250,000 just to air one. And that alone should tell us something. She goes on to say that today, Time Warner, Sony, Viacom, Disney, Bertelsmann, and News Corporation together control most publishing, music, television, film, and theme park entertainment throughout the developed world. It is estimated that by the end of the millennium, these companies will own 90% of the world's information. But it's, Hal Becker here, he's a media expert and management consultant for the Futures Group. He said during an interview, "I know the secret of making the average American believe anything I want them to. Just let me control the television. You put something on the television and it becomes a reality. If the world outside the TV set contradicts the images, people start trying to change the world to make it like the TV set images. Now you got a thing called reality TV. Yeah, it's reality TV because that has become person's reality. Yeah, it's reality TV because that has become person's reality. In other words, it should be the opposite, TV reality. But they just turn it around because most people, that is their reality. But you know something? That's ancient. That's not something that's invented by Hollywood. That was invented by Sergei Eisenstein, who was in communist Russia, one of the first people to work with film as a propaganda medium. He was a genius. And with him and Lenin and Trotsky and the rest of them, they understood the power of television as a propaganda mechanism. And all that Hollywood ever did was just co-opt exactly what these left-wingers, communists, were doing over in Russia for years. Michael Ovitz, one of the big brass in the media corporations, in an interview, he said that, look, you don't understand. It's not about money, it's about power and influence. Now, Anita Roderick, the creator of The Body Shop, she says that the language of business is not a language of the soul or the language of humanity. It's a language of indifference It's a language of separation, secrecy, and there's that key word again, hierarchy. Joel Bakan, in his absolutely phenomenal book, The Corporation, he says that Chris Hooper, ad director, voiceover artist for McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and many other corporations, says that his job is to create images that are trying to sell products to people that they don't really need, and that encourage very sophomoric behavior, irresponsible, hedonistic, egotistical, narcissistic behavior. Again, dragging you out to the surface of yourself. Whatever they can do to lead you further and further away from the self and into that collective maelstrom. Richard Robbins, in his book Global Problems and the Culture of Capitalism, says that since that time, the institutions of our society, particularly those of corporate America, have become increasingly more adept at hiding the negative consequences of our patterns of behavior. Consequences such as labor exploitation, environmental damage, poverty, and growing inequalities in the distribution of wealth. In England, says Jean Kilbourne, the legendary White Cliffs of Dover now serve as a backdrop for a laser-projected Adidas ad. American consumers have recently joined Europeans in being offered free phone calls if they'll also listen to commercials. Conversations are interrupted by brief ads tailored to match the age and social profiles of the conversants. And beer companies have experimented with messages posted over urinals, such as "Time for more Coors," or "Put used Bud here." In a very good book, A Grammatical Man, Jeremy Campbell, he says that one important property of language is that while its symbols may be used to bring about physical results in the real world of substance, they need not be used for that purpose. Symbols can be decoupled from physical reality to a greater or lesser extent. Words are not deeds, though they often lead to deeds. Symbols can be manipulated to form new statements and expressions which are only tentative, playful, and figurative. Symbols are at liberty to be a little irresponsible and experimental. Ursula Franklin, Professor Emeritus at Toronto University, says that I picture the reality in which we live in terms of a military occupation. We are occupied the way the French and Norwegians were, occupied by the Nazis during World War II. But this time by an army of marketeers. We have to reclaim our country from those who occupy it on behalf of their global masters. And again, another word that we often use, consumption. Secondary meaning of that word, or maybe even its foremost meaning, meant to pillage, to desecrate, to destroy, and also to have tuberculosis. That means inability to breathe, right? Breath, spirit, the inability to breathe, to express yourself. It's one of these consequences of this affluenza. Well, there's billion credit cards in circulation. Fewer than a third are paid off in time. In 1996, more Americans declared bankruptcy than graduated from college. Americans spend more money on driving each year than they do on health, education, or food. Although we're only 5% of the world's population, we generate 50% of the world's vehicle mileage and use 40% of the oil produced in the world. We can look a little bit at subliminals, because remember, the whole idea is, if, as I said, we're not talking about the occult aspects here, we're talking about what's sort of popularly known. And then the question arises, of course, that if we're consciously aware of what's going on, well, we would stop it, because we don't like it. But the downside of this is, you see, we have what's called an unconscious mind. It's not that simple. It wouldn't be so severe. The surreptitious nature of advertising lies in this, again, ambivalent nature of consciousness itself. And if we don't have the psychic sovereignty, if we haven't put up the defenses, then we're wide open. And the subliminal perception was mentioned as a possibility by the philosopher Aristotle, and later by the philosopher Leibniz. He dealt at length with the possibility of what he called minute perceptions that are little noticed, which are not sufficiently distinguished to be perceived or remembered, but which became known through certain consequences. It's almost like what Sigmund Freud later had discovered. You learn about the unconscious in this sort of bizarre way of negation by the gaps between thoughts. In fact, Leibniz said, "It is a great source of error to believe that there is no perception in the soul besides those of which it is conscious." Well, now the Bruce Liptons of the world are telling you that, my goodness, 99 point something percent of your consciousness is unconscious, even though that sounds quite paradoxical. But listen, long before even Leibniz times, Philo of Alexandria, the philosopher, said, it is a cruel thing that the inlets of the senses should be opened wide for the torrent of the objects of the sense to be poured, like a river in spate, into their gaping orifices with nothing to stay their violent rush. For when the mind, swallowed up by the huge inpouring, is found at the bottom, unable so much as to rise to the surface and look out. Remember I talked about the weight that might be preventing people from naturally flying? Because listen, lightness, enlightenment, it should be the most natural thing. There should be no effort required at all. So if it appears to be an effort, or people are trying to sell you some sort of ticket, we've got to worry about that. Why should that which is most... And of course we know the geniuses, they seem to have it. They seem to have it in their fingertips. They seem to have it effortlessly. Well, so should we. We become so unconscious, we become so used to the burden that we bear, that we think it's part of us. Remember the propagare, the idea of implanting something on us that is not even ours? We're weighted down and we don't even know it, and then we're wondering why we can't fly. Daniel Goleman, in a phenomenal book, one of the best books of the age, Emotional Intelligence, he says that research has shown that in the first few milliseconds of our perceiving something, we do not only unconsciously comprehend what it is, but decide whether we like it or not. The cognitive unconscious presents our awareness with not just the identity of what we see, but an opinion about it. Our emotions have a mind of their own, one which can hold views quite independently of our rational mind. Gene Kilborn says, only 8% of an ad's message is received by the conscious mind. The rest is worked and reworked deep within the recesses of the brain, where the product's positioning and repositioning take shape. Dr. Lechner goes on to say that there are over 130 million receptor rods and cones packed in less than 1 square inch of the optic nerves in our retina. Key has said that the eyes do not edit perception, and the retina transmits everything to the brain's visual cortex for processing. However, Myers has claimed that at the entry level, the retina's neural layers encode and analyze the sensory information before routing it to the cortex. Whichever the case, advertisers had done extensive study on how our brain perceives input and has found that most print advertising is designed for perceptual exposure time of less than 1 second. In other words, they are designed for the subconscious mind to absorb completely, instantaneously, while the conscious mind barely catches the headline. That's a very long-winded way of saying that time doesn't exist in the unconscious. And therefore, by using remember the scientific dictatorship? By using technical means, they can bypass the circuitry of the rational centers and work directly with this level of our being. That's what I meant when I said psychic dictatorship. Peter Russell, in his book A De-Hypnosis, says that experiments conducted by researcher Herbert Krugman reveal that when a person watches television, brain activity switches from the left to the right hemisphere. It's basically saying the same thing. The left hemisphere is the seat of logical thought. Here, information is broken down into its component parts and critically analyzed. The right brain, however, treats incoming data uncritically, processing information in wholes, leading to emotional rather than logical responses. Peter Russell goes on to say, the shift from left to right brain activity also causes the release of endorphins, the body's own natural opiates. Thus, it is possible to become physically addicted to watching television, a hypothesis borne out by numerous studies which have shown that very few people are able to kick the television habit. Let's look at a few of the techniques that are used. One is substitution. You know, instead of saying communists, you'll hear words like Reds, and if you check this out and then go to a typical Bill O'Reilly rant, you'll see this over and over again. And talking about unions, they might use the word bosses, see, to denigrate that. Like it used to be when you said Germans, you said Huns, or even worse, you in the movies they always use the word Nazi. There's a big difference between a Nazi and a German. First of all, most Nazis aren't German. And secondly, all Germans are simply not Nazis. But you wouldn't know that if you watched the propaganda movies from that era, and even today. If you want to demean Jews, you call them Yids. If you want to avoid talking about consuming or drinking, you say enjoy. So this substitution is very key to note. Here's an example of the ability to bypass the circuitry of the subconscious mind. You see one thing. We're not going to give you the answer now, but at the end of the talk, let's see if you can find the solution of the meaning, the hidden meaning in this. Oh, when I know to free hate, to sever no one. So if you have a pen and pencil, you can write that down, or just try to mentally remember it before we move on. And at the end, we'll see how many people got the solution. Because there's a hidden meaning in that sentence. Another trick is selection. The deliberate selection of the information and content that the corporate spin doctors and ad men prefer, and the willful avoidance and or elimination of that which does not serve their agendas or those of their elusive directors. I have on the forum, on the War on You page, I believe, an article from Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman, in which it shows you absolute. They even had a video that ran with this, but the article is enough. And it shows you that every single newscast that came out about the terrorist attacks of 9/11 was pre-scripted and pre-organized before the attack. Ready to go, pre-packaged. No doubt about it, non-negotiable. Repetition, as we heard one of the researchers say, that this is extremely important. The mantra-like repetition of the meme, the slogan, the jingo, ensure that it's insinuated by unthinking participators. This really works. Keeping the world safe for democracy, axis of evil, one world, new world order, stronger America, hope, justice for all. Here's another little test. I'm going to show you a series of images here. There's something that they have in common. Okay, so focus on these images and see if you can work out what they have in common. Anybody see it? I'll go back. These are just normal advertisements, some of them for small organizations. But again, let's not focus on the merchant, let's focus on the advertisers. What's common about all of those? Yeah, the colors. Absolutely. We could do a whole thing on color. Why, somebody will then ask. Oh, by the way, just an anecdote about XP. Did you know that that was Constantine, Emperor Constantine? My research is one of the chief atonists. He's, of course, officially known as the official creator of Christianity anyway. But XP was found on his coins. I've got the images on the websites and what have you, on the Irish Origins website. But the reason for those colors is because they're spiritual. They turn up in sacred art, occult art. Here's a Tibetan stupa. You find that in India, those colors are very much connected to spiritual evolution. They're partly alchemical, partly religious and mystical. On the right, you have the rose cross of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Nothing evil in the symbol itself, by the way, just for those who still haven't worked that out. But these colors are, again, found in where? The esoteric spiritual tradition. Where do you find them? On bars of soap. Hyperbole. The exaggerating and asserting things as true or actual without proof or genuine concern for contradictory viewpoints or voices. Try going on Bill O'Reilly. Everyone agrees that Zesta is the best. And then the idea of what? Authority. But we have first demonization, the cunning manufacture of a faux rival or nemesis to engender fear and trepidation. This makes the consumer grateful, compliant, and ultimately narcissistic, as well as psychologically safe. As we said, if you've got a demon banging the gates, three-headed monsters, saber rattling, and all sorts of monstrosities shaking the gates, you're going to feel very secure where you are. And this is what's perpetually going on. Years and years and years of talking about diversity and global this and global peace. And now look, then the next 5 minutes they're talking about war without end, a perpetual war against terror. And this idea also can be manufactured. Your rival, so-called, is actually manufactured. To take the opposite point of view. There's no choice between two things, by the way. And then, of course, a crucial one, authority. My doctor says, the experts agree. Insinuating what? That the work is done and that we have the absolute truth. One that's good for ourselves and everyone. Believe only the expert, not oneself. Or don't believe anyone who doesn't purport to be an expert. Turn off your own mind. We'll do your thinking for you. Allegiance. This is huge. It very much affects the young. Because it includes loyalty and identification. Human things that bond between human beings is now being transposed into inanimate things, objects. The best brand image is the image enabling the consumer to project himself into the product so that what he buys is a projection of his own supposed traits. In other words, he inwardly believes he's buying a part of himself. Look at how this works. I mean, it's contradictory, isn't it? But if you've been raped psychologically, psychically, you'll literally give more energy. Energy of your work, energy of your body, energy of your ardor to win back, to buy back what you have subliminally thought is a part of yourself, a missing part of yourself. What greater deception can you possibly imagine? And then we want to talk in the next breath about I'm seeking for enlightenment and social harmony. And we'll see a few examples of this. The cigarette ads, and let's consider the extreme versions of this in the post-9/11 rhetoric of identification with the flag, identification with the nation, identification with every tyrant that comes on television. Then, of course, a partly genuine idea is reward. But the way the media handles this is the Freudian way. It's the pleasure principle. Regressing to the child. There's nothing wrong with getting paid for work well done, is there? But when, again, it's taken to extremes. Then it's all the emphasis in advertising is on your narcissistic pleasure. Again, that idea that you really have differentiated. You're separate from the group because you're identifying with a brand and you're getting a personal reward. And let's really understand what I mean when we talk about collectivism for a moment. It's in the Disciples of the Mysterium article. Do we ever think that when we say, what do? You go, well, I work in a 7-Eleven, or I'm a taxi driver, or no, I'm a corporate guy, I'm an architect. Right? Or I'm a social worker. Or I'm a teacher. Do we ever really understand that thousands upon thousands of other people can say exactly the same thing? What kind of a description is that? Half of our names are repeatable. See, we don't even see it. It's so close to us. But Heidegger and Nietzsche brought this very point up. Maybe not in the words I'd use, but they brought it up. And they said that if you're asked, who are you? Which is a very powerful philosophical question, often asked, that's what you'll get. Well, I'm an artist, I'm a soccer player. I'm a chess master, whatever you want to name. Millions, potentially millions of people can say the same thing. We don't lose any sleep over this. What about the man who says, I am das Ein, I am the man who cares about existence? Slightly different, wouldn't you say? And that's what Heidegger is saying you have to be. That's how you have to self-define yourself. Now, why do we even need treats for hard labor or endurance? Because the thing we're doing isn't love for itself, so you need a surrogate thing? Now, J.A.C. Brown, in his book Techniques of Persuasion, says that most ad men would claim that there is a genuine science of advertising psychology, comparable, for example, with industrial psychology. The first textbook on the subject to arrive in Britain was written by Professor Walter Dill Scott, director of Psychological Laboratory at the Northwestern University in Chicago. This appeared in 1909. It was not until the late 1930s that advertising discovered Freud, and little came of this discovery until the late 40s and early 50s. Gene Kilborn says that advertising corrupts relationships and then offers us products, both as solace and as substitutes for the intimate human connection we all long for and need. Most of us know by now that advertising often turns people into objects, women's bodies and men's bodies too these days, are dismembered, packaged, and used to sell everything from chainsaws to chewing gum. We're going to see some examples in a minute. Here's a couple of advertisement headlines or mottos or whatever. Who says who says guys are afraid of commitment? He's had the same backpack for years. The insinuation that a human relationship is now to a product, to their product. That truck saved my life. Touching is good. That's a very true sentence. Wilhelm Reich would be proud. But what was it for? A technical gadget advertisement. Here's one for a sneakers advertisement. When was the last time you felt this comfortable in a relationship? At least we can be faithful to our watches. Yeah, at least. Burger King advertisement. Are you ready for a new relationship? Whiskey, alcohol, Southern Comfort. Hang on to your spirit. Diamonds, a girl's best friend. An MTV ad says, buy this 24-year-old and get his friends absolutely free. Here's one. The internet is your friend, but it doesn't have to be your only friend. So who's this authority voice, you see, that's speaking, that's giving us all this direction? This is what bothers me. Who is this all-wise oracle that's telling us how to run our lives? Gene Kilborn says that in the 1999 Super Bowl, a Victoria's Secret ad paraded bra and panty-clad models across a TV screens for more than 30 seconds. 1 million people turned away from the game to log on to the website promoted in that ad. Bernard McGrave is a PhD. He said that advertising is designed to generate an inner sense of conflict within the self. They're picking up the pieces. They're finding out what's going on in the state of decay. And we're going to look even a lot deeper in this series into all of this, because with the same idea in mind, but we have to go deeper than most of these psychologists. Gene Kilborn says that a cigarette provides the symbol of independence. A pair of designer jeans or sneakers convey status. The right perfume or beer resolves doubts about femininity or masculinity. Today, she says, we export a popular culture that promotes escapism, consumerism, violence, and greed. We end up in a world ruled by, in John Maynard Keynes' phrase, the values of the casino. On this deeper level, rampant commercialism undermines our physical and psychological health, our environment, and our civic life, and it creates a toxic society. Advertising, she says, corrupts us and promotes a dissociative state that exploits trauma and can lead to addiction. To add insult to injury, it then co-opts our attempts at resistance and rebellion. Of course, some of these ads, it's so obscure, the sexual content, it's hard to see what they were getting at. Very subtle. That can be a problem. But, of course, some of it is very subtle. For instance, this company's logo there at the bottom right, close to the vaginal area there, CTX, it's very close to the Latin cetus, which actually means vagina. And the ad men know exactly, well, the headless woman there makes you wonder, but just concentrating on the logo of the company itself has a sexual connotation. Here we have the Chanel. Again, you see the positioning of the logo and the listless, sort of apathetic pose of the model. Here's a company actually called Ovum. Of course, this is all the feminine symbolism that very much attracts the mind. Here you have the vaginal passageway in the Chanel, and right in the middle of it is for men. And by the way, if you look very closely, you'll see that even the An, A-N, is an ancient word meaning the heavens. It was like where the word Anna comes from. So the heavenly one. Very interesting symbolism there. Not to mention the fact that in numerology, C is 3. So if you put two C's together, it's 33, possibly implying the 33rd degree of Freemasonry. Here you have again the symbol. Of course, being in Sweden, we all know what Sephora means. As I say, some of them are so subtle it's hard to fathom what they were really pointing out. Here's the yoni. And Michael is the archangel name. There's a company there. And you see the phallic pin. And then this worrisome image, which you find a lot, of the female being in some sort of like spasticated, lethargic pose, which is all over the media, where not only is the body flaccid, it really implies there's no structure there. The person cannot walk, or that they have a sort of a marionette quality about them, or that there's a sort of a regressed infantilism, doll-like quality, incompetence level. As I said, the doll-like quality. Women reduced to a level of an object, of course, is absolutely ubiquitous. Or even hints at this postmodern, post-human thing we're going to look at in the next meeting. And even far worse, as we know, it's crept into these almost necrotic, necrophiliac scenes. These are advertisements for just normal things, fashion, and the models are shown like they've been murdered or strangled or whatever, covered in blood. You're finding this now in more and more videos, pop videos. Now, of course, in some of these cases, the women are not actually dead. They still appear to have some sort of life in them, and therefore there's a double meaning going on here. How can you be riddled with bullet holes and still be standing up? It's because the idea is that the blood that's on them is the result of their crime. That they are some sort of vampire who's committed the crime and is in a state of satiation or listlessness, not because they have been murdered or killed. It's a twisted mind. Well, we're in the realms of the insane here, so it's Dante's Inferno. But the idea is then that the woman is not the victim, but she is in fact the perpetrator. And this then causes this mixed messages that we've been talking about, which in that case, she's deserving of being killed. She's deserving of her fate. And this concept of the vamp and the basically femme fatale is hugely important. The Salem Company, cigarette company, uses the backward writing, that Salem is actually males backwards, because in the unconscious mind it doesn't matter if a word is backwards or forwards. To the unconscious mind, it receives the message loud and clear. And this whole idea of this vampiristic, predatory, headless female is absolutely one of the worst, corruptions. But then another important thing to notice is this concept of androgyny, which is again a very spiritual, sacred thing, right? The desire to unify the masculine and feminine within yourselves. It's part of alchemy, it's part of Hermetic science, it's part of the whole yogic tradition, magical tradition, whatever you want to call it, or at least it was originally. And then again, like they said, knowing that we want that, knowing that that's the goal of all spirituality, all magic, all yoga, all science, even if you really want to go that deep, what's known in the alchemical tradition as the chemical wedding, the advertisers, again, drawing upon all of that occult wisdom, often use this. In fact, if you want a really, really beautiful, exotic example of this, get out Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula movie and watch the last scene, when in fact you see the protagonist and the female literally becoming one as they rise upward. In this, of course, he's borrowing this from Jean Cocteau, I might add, but you'll see this incredible nucleation of the masculine and the feminine. But that's in a movie that's talking about spirituality and transcendence and crucifixion. It's not quite the same thing as what Saks Fifth Avenue's thinking. But the fusion of the yin and the yang and the masculine and the feminine is an extremely powerful motif in the unconscious mind. And these fellows are really up on that. They really use this a lot. And here we have the whole Jungian thing of the persona, the masculine and the feminine. Not male and female. We're not just talking simply about male and female. That has no meaning at all. Masculine and feminine is what animates us. And we have both of those inside. We have many advertisements, for instance, of the return to the mother, the return to the womb idea. The time is short, so we have to kind of go through these rather quickly. But the O is the symbol of the ovum, the ova, like we saw earlier, the womb. And here you have the man and the phallic bottle. You see, you have the Holy Grail chalice, and you have the phallic bottle with the O, and the O is always the life, for age upon age, it's been the symbol of the feminine and the mother, and the state of immersion into that state. And so you see them borrowing these ancient motifs. Eve, the apple, temptation, evil, right? A simple Washington Apple Company. The advertiser knew exactly what to do to draw you in, to start using biblical symbolism. Here you have the ovum and the phallus again. Here again you have the Chanel, but again it's the womb, the vesica Pisces, and the circle, the all-enclosing circle. It's basically a magical alchemical image, and there you see the male and the female again in their alchemical embrace, simulating the chemical wedding. Of course, in science we know that the female gene or chromosome is represented by the letter X, and that's why you see it so often, symbolizing the feminine. And if you feminize something by a symbol, an O, an S, or an X, if you feminize the image, it attracts men. It is it will immediately feminize something. And there's other symbols that masculinize things. Here the model is, there you have the two letters of the feminine, the X and the O, and then there she is. This is one of my absolute favorites. I cannot stress, like that particular quote we had, about the genius of these people. The well of knowledge that they draw from. Illegitimately, of course, but nevertheless. Here is the cosmic mother, the ovum, the female, and the balloons represent the sperm. You know a balloon, right, with a little string? So what you're actually seeing is a sexual act, it's conception. And they talk about millions of sperm coming around the ovum. Now what you see is just some model surrounded by balloons. But wow, how your unconscious sees it is totally different. And that's where the power lies. But then turning to astrotheology is one of the hermeneutics that crack this code. The symbol of the eagle, the symbol of the angel, the symbol of the sky. Or mudras are very, very important. Holy sacred mudras. You'll see Barbara Bush having used this. You'll see, what's her name, Michelle Obama, and so many others using these mudras. Oprah Winfrey, they all use this. Here's a woman, Jean advertised sitting literally in a yoga pose in a state of prayer. Here you have East meets West. The woman on the left is in the Egyptian state of resurrection. And on the right you have the Christian. And then the colors, the coloring of the models. Their entire pose is reminiscent of the highest art. There you see on the left John the Baptist with the arms crossed in exactly that way. Oh, no head. No head. No head. They love these headless women. Here we have a spirit. Right? Again, breath, spiritus. Well, that was feminine in the Gnostic tradition, wasn't it? Light. The concept of light. The concept of the Christ. They're always selling you something. Remember? You can't get it from within yourself, so you inherit it from external means. Here you have almost like floating on the water, walking on the water. And again, the use of yoga and meditation and spirituality. Where there's life, there's bud. This vampiristic way to make you feel that now you become dependent on the external stimuli of the world. Well, first of all, they're telling you don't need to give meaning to life. Life is there to give you meaning. But secondly, they're even saying that, through our products, through our creations, you gain that life, turning you into basically a vampire. Come alive. You're in the Pepsi generation. And then the narcissism again. Tom Selleck here, I don't let anything get in the way of my enjoyment. Well, that's good to know. Or pleasure to burn, if it feels good, do it. Nike's just do it. The energy you crave. Yeah, well, what's the downside of all of that? And then this thing I pointed out before is this whole concept of the usage of light. We have commercials we could show that even just amazing examples of this. But then even in the beer where it's meant to be a light beer, L-I-T-E, and yet the spelling is clearly light, luminescence. So when you're drinking that alcohol or you're drinking that beverage, the idea is that you're being enlightened. You're drinking something of the light. What's that? That's spiritual. That's part of your spiritual journey. The idea of imbibing light, the Holy Grail, the truth. And also the settings that these are put in, this idyllic, sun-bathed settings, are also very attractive, you see, on a certain level. Skip through some of these. I'm going to get this. Oh, it's my car. Sorry. Here we are. Here's the right one. Take a word like, this is just one example of many. On the DVD there's more, but centra. Interesting word that doesn't mean anything in English. That's because it's not meant to. It's a composite word. And it's in fact a non-English word, and that should always alert you when the word is not English. There's something else going on there. It's either a Latin word or a Greek word or a Hebrew word or even a word from the Majkl tradition. And this word is a composite word that embodies a lot of different other phrases like center and centaur and enter and scent and serpent. You see, and ra. It has all these connotative phonemes and connections. Very much the same with the Mazda. In fact, the owner of the Mazda company named it after Ahura Mazda, the god of the sun, because he was a Zoroastrian. I mean, he openly admitted that he was part of that organization and named his company accordingly. And by the way, that is the sign of Aries, which is always sacred house of the zodiac to solar cults. Nisan is the same as the Jewish first month, where the sun rises on the horizon. That's why you have that circle rising above what looks like a border, with the word Nisan in it, that literally means the place of the sun rising on the first month of the Jewish New Year. So we have astrotheology there. We've got the usage of words. Here's another one of those composite terms, lexis. If you turn the word backwards, you get succel, and that is a composite word that involves words like success and sex and cell and lux, which is Latin for light. And even the idea that so many logos come in a circle. If we have time at some future point, we can discuss this. Sprite is really a take on the word spirit, of course. So again, you see some advertisement where they're drinking this stuff. The subconscious mind picks it up slightly differently than the conscious mind. And there they're using the sort of a yin-yang symbol. Phila is often the one I use because this is very interesting. Again, it's a word that doesn't really mean anything in English, but if you turn it backwards, it has a lot of meaning in the occult tradition because it's Aleph, the very first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And that's where we get our English word alive from, meaning life. So if you turn life backwards, then you have death. So the word phila actually really represents death or blackness. Here we have the return to the womb. But look at the logo at the top left. When we get to our part on post-humanism, we'll see how many advertisements have been for many years past suggesting this technocratic age that's to come. Let's see if we can move forward a bit. Some of the sexual stuff there. Here's an interesting one. It's very blatant. People have pointed out that this is Aries, it's the devil, blah, blah, blah. But actually, if you really examine the symbol, you'll notice that it's actually a replica of the female generative reproductive system. So it all looks very macho and male on the outside, but it's something quite different on the inside. And some of them are more blatant, of course. I don't think I'll go to get my tooth fixed there. Or here. And for children, of course, you know, you have all sorts of pornographic stuff. The kids exchange. Yeah. And you can really get into depth and analyze the various positionings and like the girl on the left, the praying mantis, and the whole idea of menage a trois and stuff like that. And a lot of symbolism goes into this, a lot of fascinating stuff. As I say, I went into this in the DVD a lot. Let's go to this last one, which is particularly pernicious. You'll often hear this come to the Marlborough country as the logo that they chose. And again, you think about all the thousands of things they could have chosen. Why did they choose this? And why these particular series of images? So we actually, this is what it really means. The come is the orgasm, of course. It's a very famous word used in advertising to represent orgasm. And country is actually a play on words. It's not particularly flattering to women. And it represents, so when you see the hero, the macho hero, roping the cow, you can imagine exactly what it's hinting to. And they use the same idea for the female. The virgin smoking, the smoking virgin, the smoking virgina, the hot chick. And tastes is the take on the word testes for testosterone. Burn slower is sexual, of course. Lasting longer is all sexual rhetoric. And let's never forget, Jean Kilbourne points out something very important that ties into what we've been talking about archetypes, about that content of the unconscious. She says that the Jolly Green Giant, the Michelin Man, the Man from Glad, Aunt Jemima, Alka-Seltzer, the White Knight, and all these otherworldly kin are really descendants of earlier gods. Right? They're simulacras, but behind them are those archetypes that matter a lot, and they're the content of our unconscious. And you can see this again in the movies, in certain fantastic protagonists and otherworldly champions, undefeatable heroes, shape-changing, larger-than-life type of heroes. Some positive, some negative. Very much play on this concept, the invulnerable ones. Every 10 years they wheel out some other type of superhero because this appeals to that regressed, repressed individual. Look at on the left of Viva Vendetta, how the swords that he's holding become horns above the girl's head. And on the right, this becomes a triangle. The figures actually become a triangle. These are very ancient motifs, by the way. Or some sort of intrepid, heroic guy that we can identify with, you see. Or again, some sort of justice concept. There's so much injustice in our world, so then we identify with... and I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just saying this is how it works. And we can embody this in our own lives as well, in our own artwork. We need to be aware of this. But the trouble is that what happens in fiction is perfectly fine. I'm okay with all kinds of fiction, even violent fiction. There's nothing wrong with it because it's fiction. But the point is that can so easily then turn into... Oh, excuse me, wrong one. Oh. What am I looking for? Oh yeah, it can so easily turn into this. Something in the films can so easily transpose itself and turn into a very real life scenario. And then you got life being affected, fiction affecting life. Or you can have the perfect lover, the perfect male sort of archetype. And we'll get into some, when we get into the secret society symbolism, we'll revisit one or two of these and show you. Or again, the wise man of the hills, the wise one, the elder. It's also a very powerful archetype that we lost because we've lost that grandparent shamanic tradition, remember? So they vamp it, upgrade it, and then of course the animus. And in fact, some shows are entirely based on archetypes. They're primordial archetypes, scenarios. That's why they have record ratings, and we identify with these people. And what's really happening, though, is that we're again losing our actual sense of identity. This is the really crucial problem. So did anybody work out what that was? Oh, when I know to free hate, to sever no one. It's actually a phone number. Oh, when I know to free hate, to sever no one. How many people got that? In other words, how many people would get a piece of subliminal content? This is just an example, so regardless of what it was. The fact is very few. Certainly you wouldn't get it in a few seconds like we had that little experiment. This is what I'm talking about. It goes right across into the unconscious mind, and the unconscious mind gets it because there it is, it's a reality. And so this is just one of many examples of what we're talking about. Anyway, we can... how much time do we have? 5 minutes. Well, that just leaves me enough time to thank you all. Welcome, you, and welcome you back as well. And just thank you for, blame Peter if it's been a hassle, but thank you very much for being here today. Thanks, Peter. Give Peter a round of applause, too. Let me just briefly then just share with you what we will be doing next time. Very quickly. Program 2 will be looking deeply into ancient sorcery. What I've done here is to sketch out what we know today, give you an overview, a lot of what you already know, so that we can then start looking at the history of this thing. And this is going to be very empowering as well, because then we're going to see where they went to for this archive of knowledge that they're using against us. We'll look a bit more into the actual facts of mind control. As I said, we'll look into the secret society symbolism, which is ubiquitous now. You're finding it everywhere. And something very, very dark, which is the satanic cults that operate in Hollyweird, as I call it, or Hollywood, which I've referred to in other works as the Dionysian cult. As I said, they may be arguably not the top of the pyramid, which is another very select brotherhood. But these are individuals who are sort of lieutenants that cover a lot of ground. And it's their handiwork that you're seeing. And I've studied this since the 80s, and this will probably be one of the first times I've really go into it in any kind of depth and naming the names, basically, taking the lid off the top and showing some of the names that you may be not familiar with, various organizations. And then in Program 3, we'll move on and look at some of the post-human, transhumanist concepts that we dealt with in the Architects of Control, some more movie symbolism, and then ultimately come up to the solutions section, in which we look at some positive symbolism, how this whole thing can be turned around and reinvigorated with the magic as opposed to the sorcery, and then finish with solutions to this whole issue, which again will tie into the psychological and philosophical aspects of this. So you're invited back next time. I look forward to seeing you all and being here again. Thank you so much for being here today.